Excellent. So welcome everybody to session 3 of the 2023 Responsible Raw Materials Annual Conference. We've got another fabulous lineup for you in this third of 6 sessions that we put on for you this year, all focused on the material value chains, the criticality of trust. I was trying to jump the gun there and get into the whole trust word as early as possible, because we've had some fabulous discussions, not always with people agreeing with one another, which is great, all focusing in on what does trust mean within either the raw materials value chain, and that could include everything from exploration, digging holes in the ground or extracting the material that we need, processing it, all the way through into the full value chain in terms of different forms of processing it, going into different technology, and then of course into hopefully the circular economy, so different forms of reuse, recycling, etc. So lots of different perspectives, lots of different hints and tips with regards to what does trust look like, how can we create it, and what does it look like as well when it begins to have a little bit of a wobble. So some of the people that we've already heard from during the course of this week include Minister Ghani. So she's the closest we've got to a mining minister here in the UK, and she opened the conference with the perspective from a politician's angle. So that was really interesting, especially in the UK, where actually mentioning the word mining in the halls of our government has not necessarily been a cunning move if you want to maintain the vote of your constituency. And so this was great because she provided insight as to what is happening in that political sphere, be it in the UK, but also Europe, America, Australia, etc., with regards to raw materials, especially because, of course, there's huge focus with regards to these materials now, because we need lots of them, especially if we're going to be able to navigate our energy transition in the most responsible manner. We've also heard from a variety of other individuals. So we've heard from people who are involved in minerals governance and very much making sure that sustainability and ESG is included within that. Now, I personally am originally a geologist, so of course everybody loves the rocks, but there's no point in deciding that the rocks look lovely if you don't also take into consideration and very much fully respect the people and, of course, the environment in which that place those rocks sit. So we've spoken to a number of different people who are experts with regards to the rock governance, as it might be called, and also individuals who work for some of the world's larger, but also smallest mining companies. So we've heard from individuals who are experts with regards to responsibility and the creation of trust from some of the world's larger mining organizations. And we've also heard from some individuals who work in some of the world's smallest mining organizations, such as artisanal gold miners in Burkina Faso, all the way through to gem miners in Malawi, which has been absolutely brilliant. We've also explored some more of the theoretical aspects or the academic aspects with regards to the economy of raw materials. And this morning was kicked off by Professor Paul Ekens, who I think actually Ludovine is maybe his biggest fan. I'm pretty sure that Ludovine actually does go stalking him, but it's great. Or maybe your cat does, Ludovine. Oh, yes, we all love Ramon. He's fantastic. And so Paul Ekens gave us insight into some of the latest work that he's been doing from a financial basis with regards to raw materials and what does it look like with regards to ensuring that sustainable development is very much at the heart of everything that is done within all of this. We also heard from a number of other individuals, again, so from all over the world, people discussing what does a lawyer bring to the table with regards to trust, but also what do politicians bring to the table with regards to trust? And are there any hints or tips that we can learn if you're trying to engage with people and get them to be interested, perhaps, in what it is that you're attempting to do? Finally, we've heard from people who push back against the mining sector as well. So the whole purpose of Responsible Raw Materials, which was founded back in 2020, is to bring together people that don't necessarily agree with one another. And in fact, to be honest, are rarely found in the same room together. The whole purpose of this forum is so that we can listen to all of those different perspectives. Yes, of course, we can have our own feelings with regards to all of that, but we want to air all of those comments, air those concerns, and hear what do people really think about all of those different aspects with regards to what they feel is important. So With regards to responsible raw materials as a whole, as I mentioned, we were founded back in 2020. So in May 2020, many of you will have dialed in back then and found Rose and I. Rose still looks fabulous. I certainly look a few years older than I was back then. And we held our first ever conference. And you can actually find a whole load of the information with regards to our previous conference just by clicking on past events in the website. And what you will find here are links back to our 2020 annual conference. And that first conference brought together a whole wide range of different fantastic people who explored what is meant by responsibility with regards to raw materials. There were many outputs from that conference, including people saying, hey, we quite liked this. Can we do that again? And of course, here we are a number of years later carrying it on. But if nothing else, I think we all agreed that, yes, raw materials should be responsible. So great. That was a good agreement to come to at the end of that conference. Cycle forwards 12 months. And in 2021, we said, okay, we now all agree that, yes, raw materials should be responsible in terms of how they are explored for, how they're extracted, processed, shipped, etc., how they're looked after. But how on earth do we actually make this a reality? How do we make ESG or sustainability real with regards to raw materials? And it was a case here of, we're not saying that it's not being done in a responsible way at the moment across the world. There are many examples of good practice that we can draw on. So let's learn from one another. Let's share those hints and tips of good practice that works in some parts of the world. Let's not constrain ourselves just to say the mining sector. Let's go to other sectors as well and say, what can we learn from all of them? So lots and lots of hints and tips and tools were brought to the fore in our 2021 conference, which was surprisingly enough called the ESG Toolbox. So that's fantastic. Then coming through to last year, 2022, and last year's conference was called Unlocking a Just Transition, or what is the role of mining in unlocking a just energy transition? And this was inspired because earlier on in that 12-month cycle, so in November 2021, Glasgow, which is actually where I originally went to university, Glasgow hosted COP26, so the big climate change conference. And it was a fantastic conference. And actually, so Richard was there and we sat down and we had some fantastic conversations. Richard, you had all kinds of amazing people who went along to your events, which were brilliant. By the way, so this is a hint. If you ever have a chance to go to a Natural History Museum event, go, because it's always awesome in terms of the people that they get to go and speak and engage. But at COP26, really interesting conference, but there was a massive gap, and that was raw materials, because mining was told, you're basically not welcome because you're not part of this climate change solution. And you can see where that thought process came from. But as somebody who works within the raw material sector, I personally found it quite frustrating because I thought, okay, well, where are we going to get the material for? Wind turbines, photovoltaics, batteries, etc. Where on earth do we think this stuff's going to come from? We don't have enough in circulation at the moment for it all to come from recycled material, let alone actually having the right bits and pieces that we need for all of this new technology that we're beginning to make use of. Plus, of course, the world's population is growing, so we need more of it anyway. So that was something there where perhaps there was a little bit of oversight in terms of the role of mining within the energy transition. And it wasn't just a fact that mining wasn't invited or welcome at that particular conference, but also the huge amount of opportunity potentially being missed out on, because of course, mining happens all over the world and can be a mechanism through which wealth can be unlocked and different forms of development can be enabled in those parts of the world if it is done properly. And of course, that is a big if with regards to the world of responsible raw materials. So those were our conferences over the last few years, which were absolutely brilliant and have given rise to a whole load of spin-off material and other conferences. And all of that information can be found on our websites, which if you go back into the website again, and I shall reshare my screen, if you go into the 2023 conference tab, not only will you be able to find the agenda that we're working our way through this week, so all these fabulous speakers that we've got lined up for you here today and through the rest of the week. But also, if you click on talks, you will be able to find where all of the talks, not only from the last 2 sessions, are already loaded into here, but you'll also find lots of the talks from the previous year's conferences as well. So just to take one to show you an example of this. So here's Paul Eakins. This is his talk from this morning with his abstract, his biography. And what we're doing is if people are sharing slides, for example, with us as well, we'll be able to load them into these little blog posts, as it were, for you to make use of. So lots of material that's there for you. What we've also got, of course, are a whole load of learning materials. So feel free to go and raid all of those if you decide that what we're talking about during the conference is really boring. So go and take a look at all of that. But as previously mentioned, if you want to go back and take a look at the agenda, this is where you can find it in the proceedings. So just to zoom in on this a little bit, we will let everybody introduce themselves when we get to their talks. But what we're going to talk about this afternoon, we're going to start off with the wonderful Robin. So Robin is going to teach us all how to listen. And I'm quite nervous with regards to this session because I get to be the guinea pig. And so I'm going to be listening very hard, Robin, which will probably cloud my ability to listen. So there we go. I've already made my excuses. Excellent. So we're going to start off with the fantastic Robin and learn how to listen. And then secondly, we're going to go over to North America to Priscilla, who's going to say, right, we're going to put our finger on one of the big gremlins with regards to mining, and that is tailings dams, because they quite like to fail every so often. And so how do we therefore look at trust with regards to tailings dams? Well, they're going to hop across the channel to mainland Europe, and we're going to speak to Johannes and Volker, who are going to introduce their systemic consensing approach to us. So I'm really looking forward to all of this. Johannes and Volker, it's going to be great. Then we've got Jan and Adrian Joseph, who's going to be speaking to us from the perspective of the impact negotiation group. So trust in a negotiation. I think it's going to build on some of the discussions we had this morning, really in a really fantastic manner. Then back to the Natural History Museum here in the UK to Richard Harrington, who's going to take us into the world. I'm pretty sure he's going to mention the word biodiversity within about 2 seconds of his talk, if I know Richard. So that's going to be absolutely wonderful. Then over to Australia, and because Leanne loves to work in the middle of the night, Leanne will be speaking to us in the middle of the night from Australia. And Leanne is the founder of Everledger, which is one of the preeminent transparency technologies that is out there at the moment. She'll give us insight into actually what works and perhaps what doesn't work with regards to making sure that we understand where those materials come from. And then finally, this afternoon, we're going to be joined by John Crawley, who is a gentleman who I have the sheer pleasure of doing lots and lots of work with. We do deliver lots of training together to all kinds of organizations around the world. But John, in a previous life, took part in the Northern Irish peace process. So this is an opportunity for us to learn from a situation where you had different stakeholders who really didn't want to be in a room together, yet it required them to come together, to listen to one another, to see one another's perspectives in order to work out a way forwards. So I'm really looking forward to listening to John and hearing some of his insights and some of his learnings he can give to us with regards to that Irish perspective in terms of creating trust. So that's our lineup for this afternoon's conference. As you can see from the agenda, we've got lots more tomorrow and then on Friday as well. So we'll really look forward to welcoming you all to engage in discussion with us over the next few days, depending on how you have dialed in to this session. So if you're in the Zoom meeting, welcome to the wonderful world of Zoom. You can engage with us either by typing into the chat or typing in Q&As just by clicking on the little box at the bottom of the screen. Feel free to share your thoughts, words, wisdom, questions, whatever the case might be. If you've got links that you'd like to share with us to enhance the debate and the dialogue, then please do feel free to do that as well. We can't hear you or see you, unfortunately. That's just a functionality of the webinar side of things. It's not because we don't respect you. It's just because we're trying to keep a vague semblance of control on the proceeding. So please do feel free to engage with us through both chat and also through the Q&A. If you have dialed in via YouTube instead, welcome to the wonderful world of YouTube. You'll see that there's a chat function that's enabled within YouTube. So please do feel free to share your thoughts and feelings with regards to that. And I know that Richard is always great at responding in the chat on YouTube as well. So feel free to engage with that, and I shall endeavour to bring in your questions for our speakers, even if you're posting them in there. In the world of YouTube. Also, as well, feel free to ask questions through LinkedIn, Twitter, WhatsApp, whatever else. And I told this story this morning. Somebody did once try to phone me in the middle of a session to ask a question. That didn't really work very well, because I'm not going to pick up my phone at the moment, but do feel free to engage us in any which way you would like. So with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to our first session just a little bit early, because I'm so excited to open the door on this first session that we have with us. I am truly delighted to welcome to the stage the wonderful Robin. Now, Robin, I don't know if you've got slides to share right now.
I will pop my slides up.
Fantastic. So whilst Robin is sharing the slides that we will be looking at over the next few minutes, I know that they're going to then use me as a guinea pig and see if this stuff works. So I shall be listening intently with regards to what Robin has to say. As we're working through this, if you do have questions for Robin or just comments to make, do you please feel free to pop them into the chat, and that will mean that we'll be able to bring you in on the discussion as well. So I'm just going to take a little look to make sure that we're getting the slides.
My Zoom just crashed, Sarah, so I've been let back into the meeting. So
yay!
I hope you can see my slides now.
We can not only see the slides, but you're back in the meeting. That is how smooth the team have got things running at the moment.
Incredible.
It's incredible. So once we've got over that, congratulations. Well done, everybody. That was awesome. I'm going to pass over to the wonderful Robin. Thank you very much, Robin.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I'm really excited to hear about the other talks this afternoon. I almost wish they'd gone first, because I feel like they'd feed really well into some of the things that I'd like to cover. But we'll come back to them in the panel at the end, I guess. So really something to look forward to. But yeah, just welcome everyone, and thanks very much for being here. So my role generally is a coach and organisational development consultant, and I'm very much not the expert when it comes to responsible raw materials or raw materials generally. However, my first job after university was in fact for a geoscience training company. So I'm actually super excited to be back here, because I always found there was something really exciting about being with people who are working with like the Earth's raw materials. I was such a nerd for rocks and minerals as a child. So thank you for having me back. It's like I've come full circle. So this is just setting out a couple of objectives and agenda, but really I'll be covering a very simple technique, which I hope will be useful and interesting to you, and won't be spending much time talking, I hope. So let's progress. So a few reasons why collaboration is so necessary in the world of making your value chains more sustainable. I don't want to patronize you, because I think, to be honest, at a human to human level, you very much understand, likely much better than I do, why it's so important for us to collaborate to address these huge global issues. I pulled a few of the Sustainable Development Goals onto this slide. But I think I'd love to hear if anyone who's listening wants to pop anything in the chat about your personal reasons for collaboration. Like, why is it important to you and to your organization to actually go beyond the boundaries? So leading up to today, I asked some of the Satala people what do they consider the main barriers to collaboration within the raw materials sector. And they gave me back 3 challenges, which I've sort of paraphrased here. And I'll briefly cover them. But what I want to say to begin with is what really struck me about these 3 challenges is they are the same challenges that I've come across when I've been working with the National Health Service on their barriers to collaboration as well. So a completely different sector, also facing this very, very significant need to go beyond their traditional competitive model and actually work together to address what is otherwise quite a catastrophic situation in the health sector. So you're really not alone. But yeah, just looking quickly at these three challenges, there was a perception, or there's often a perception, that there'll be different incentives within organizations, and that those different incentives will lead to misalignment and like different expectations or incompatible expectations with regards to the collaboration. And the second one is around really not having that kind of shared understanding about what each organization actually brings to the value chain. There's often a sense of, well, our role is the most important role, we're the experts here, and that can lead to a lack of respect. And then finally, there's a real sense that when there's a failure in the supply chain or somewhere in the process of collaboration, there's a sense of self-protection for the organizations, which really closes down collaboration, leading to a lack of transparency and a kind of like grabbing the resources for your own organization. But in the long term, that's extremely damaging to the relationship. So what's really common to all of these three is trust and a lack of trust in the first place, and also damage to trust through behaviors. And obviously that's a key to what you're talking about in this conference, which I'm so pleased to hear. So what do we do about this? The art of culture change. So I work with organizations on internal culture in many facets of their work. And we often talk about this iceberg model, where what we often see on the surface is people's behavior, but that's driven underneath the surface by policies, procedures, and processes, or policies, procedures, and rules, I should say. And then right at the bottom, at this deepest level, we've got people's beliefs and values. And there's work to be done at all three of these levels, but the point of this iceberg model is really that if you're not addressing the beliefs and values, it's very difficult to make real change at the higher levels. But equally, the lowest level tends to be the most difficult level to work at. But I have what I think is very good news, which is this little tool which I'd love to share with you today, which is called reflective listening. And it's my belief that through this one tool, you can actually address all three of these levels of culture change. So reflective listening is a behavior, but through carrying out reflective listening, we actually can discover shared values. We can surface values and come to a place of better alignment. And through this process of reflective listening, we can also find out where the processes are actually getting in the way of effective collaboration. So this is the bit which poor Sarah is has very, very gamely been volunteered to help me to demonstrate. I mean, ordinarily I would be running this as a workshop, and I would, you know, in an ideal world, I would have loved to have breakout rooms where everyone can actually have a go at this themselves, because it is one of those things where really just practicing it yourself, you'll get a much better understanding of the value of it. But I still think it's going to be really insightful, hopefully, to have Sarah, who's not been prepared for this. She doesn't know what I'm going to ask her to do, to, in front of everybody, give it her best shot. And and so we'll go with that. So first of all, Sarah, I'm not going to ask you to do this technique first. I'm going to demonstrate how it's done with your help. So, but just to quickly run through the steps. So reflective listening is really as simple as it sounds. It's first of all just listening to. So let's put it in a context. So you're meeting with someone from a different organization, and you're trying to like brainstorm something that you think needs to work better in order to collaborate better. So the first stance that I'm inviting you to take is listen in order to understand. So while you're listening, if you need to, you should ask for pauses so that you can check your understanding, rather than just listening to someone for minutes on end, losing the trail. Actually understanding is vital to this process. And then repeating back in these pauses what you've understood so far. And if you need any clarity on what you've heard, ask at that point. And then once you've reflected it back, just check in, have I understood you correctly, before moving on if there's anything else they want to share. And I put a bonus here at the bottom, which is additional to the typical reflective listening technique, but it can actually really, really positively impact a sense of building trust and empathy between the parties. So after listening to what the person said in full, there's an invitation to consider what matters most to that person and reflect it back to them by saying, what seems to matter most to you is ... something like that. So let's give it a go, Sarah. And you don't know what I'm going to ask you, but I'm aiming for about, I think we've got a little bit of extra time. So 3 or 4 minutes kind of thing. And I'd love to ask you to tell me about something that personally impacted you so far in the conference. And I will reflect back to you as we go. And I'm just going to stop sharing if that's okay, so that we can really see each other a little bit better.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Robin. Okay, so something that has personally impacted me during the course of this conference so far. So I think the most personal story for me, and something that I found very interesting to reflect on, was this morning a friend who I did a lot of traveling with 20 years ago came and gave a talk. So Quinton Newcomb, who is now a lawyer, he's a judge, which I think is really very impressive, of course, having met him so long ago. But the reason why he came and spoke to us today was not only because he was describing what does trust mean and look like from a legal perspective, but also as a judge, but also because I went down my first ever mine with him 20 years ago. And that mine, as we were discussing this morning, it's an artisanal mine. So it's one that doesn't make use of big mechanized machines. It is in Bolivia. So it's in a very poor part of the world. And the history of this mine is really one of historically exploitation. So
can I just stop you there to check? So because there's a lot of things that I'm tracking, and I just want to check that I'm on the same page as you. So it sounds like there was a particular talk this morning with someone who you had a really personal connection with. Quinton Newcomb, is that the right name?
Yeah, that's correct.
So, and he's now a judge. He was previously a lawyer.
Yeah.
And 20 years ago, you went backpacking with him, and you actually visited this mine in Bolivia. And I think I'm understanding that this mine it's a low tech mine. So you said artisanal. There wasn't the machines and things. And you were just about to talk about exploitation in that context. Yeah, yep. Have I got everything so far?
Perfect, and much more eloquently put. So thank you very much for that, Robin. So yeah, with regards to this mine, so the reason I guess why it's resonating with me is it's a very personal story, and I can remember how I felt when we went deep underground. So we got taken underground through all of these little tunnels where you were sliding along on your tummy and you were going down ladders with all the rungs missing. So just using the nails on the side of the bits of the woods to climb down into what really did feel like the depths of the earth. We were probably actually very shallow, but at the time it felt like we were a long way underground, and it was dark. So yeah, we had little head torches, but it was very dark, and all you could hear, other than your own breathing, and of course the person in front of you and the person behind you as we were going deeper into the mountain, was the tap, tap, tap of people chipping away at rock within this silver mine. So people were mining for silver. And that was something where, and reading my diary last night with regards to that experience, I was so naive. There was so much that I was surprised by at the time. And I think that the talk this morning just really got me thinking, not necessarily during the talk itself, but reflecting on it, of how much your opinions and your feelings can change when you become more knowledgeable about something. So that was a case where understanding the mining itself was really interesting. Knowing what I know today, would I have gone deep into that mine with almost no health or safety? Probably not. I don't think I'd be brave enough to do that now. But in terms of understanding the context in which people were still mining in that environment, was absolutely phenomenal for someone when I was 20 years younger than I am now.
Yeah. So amazing story, and I'm really getting a sense from when you were describing that trip down to the mine that experience still feels like it's very much in you. You can still remember how it felt to be climbing down those rungs, like the rungless ladders, just hanging onto the nails, and going through those really narrow tunnels on your tummy, and just having that, the way you described the tap tap tap, it was very evocative. Yeah, and I noticed that there was the time lapse since then, and that the experience that your career has taken you on has really given you much more of an insight into what it was that you were actually letting yourself in for at that time. But at the same time, you were very glad that you had that experience, so that it actually gives you an embodied sense of what it's like to be in the mining industry in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that was something where, so when I was down that mine, it was slightly more than 20 years ago, to be brutally honest. I'm making myself feel younger than I actually am. So that was just before I went to university. And I went to university to study geography initially. This is where Richard Harrington falls over, because he thinks I'm a geologist. I started off studying geography, but in a Scottish university, you do 3 subjects in your first year, and then you begin to specialize. So I did geography, geology, and environmental science. And it in part was having been down that mine and begun to understand, okay, so what is it about these rocks that was, I think, one of the little seeds in the back of my mind that began to say, hang on, there's something very interesting with regards to all of this in terms of where our raw materials come from. And
Sarah, I'm just going to have to pause you there, sorry, just because of time. And I just wanted to end that reflection by just noting that as you went on your degree, that geography degree course, you had actually, because you'd had that experience, it gave you that kind of question mark of, okay, there's something here, there's something about this reality that actually concerns me.
Yeah, absolutely. So there was something that concerned me about it, and I said, okay, I found it fascinating, very curious about it, and also thinking, should we be doing that now in this day and age, or should we be able to harvest these materials in a more responsible way?
Yeah, thanks for that clarification. So it's really specifically around, like, how is there not a way of doing this more responsibly? Yeah. So that really nicely just takes us to what seems to really matter to you and why you're in fact here today doing this conference. So thank you for that.
Pleasure.
Yeah, and just in terms of getting through the rest of it on time, I'd just love to ask you for like 1 or 2 sentences about how that felt for you to be listened to in that way.
So it felt that you were actually listening to me rather than just suffering my little telling of a story. And thank you as well for allowing me to tell a story that doesn't often get told with regards to something from my past. So it felt comforting and I guess empowering as well. So it meant that I could actually not change the story, but actually change where I was taking it to try and kind of say, okay, you are listening to me, great, I can ratchet it up a notch. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that's a great insight. So it was like, because we were building that mutual understanding, you knew you could take it to a deeper level of what meant more to you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that. Okay, so I'm going to invite you to give it a little go, and we haven't got a lot of time, so you don't have to try for ages. And I want to just say to begin with, like, what I've been practicing this for a really long time, so I'm doing quite a lot of paraphrasing rather than directly repeating back. But a really good place to start is you can actually just directly repeat back what the person says.
Okay.
So yeah, just if you just ask me a question, then again, for anyone else watching, I don't know what Sarah's going to ask me, and we'll just do it for like a couple of minutes before opening up, see if there's any questions.
Brilliant. Thanks, Robin. Okay, well, I would be intrigued to understand why you said yes to our invitation to come and speak to us today.
Thanks for asking. Yeah, it was really exciting. So I saw Emily's post in a network that I'm part of, seeking speakers. I saw the word trust, I saw the word empathy, which are things that I spend a lot of time thinking about professionally. And in the context of responsible raw materials, it's absolutely bang in the middle of what I'm really passionate about, which is being there to support organizations who are actually trying to do like environmental sustainability and social impact work better. So I'm not I'll pause there.
Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you with that. So just to reflect that back at you, it's a case here of you really enjoy supporting organizations who want to do things better, especially with regards to that environmental and social aspect. And it was the post that the fabulous Emily managed to put up on LinkedIn with regards to trust and empathy. So those words that really sparked your attention. Is that correct?
That's exactly it. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. I think, to be honest, that's probably captured my main reasons. So I feel fully heard. Thank you.
Am I allowed to ask you questions, Robin? Is that part of it?
Yeah. So you mean, are you allowed to ask me follow-up questions, or what?
Yeah.
What's your? Yeah. I mean, it's in terms of right now, I think it's really great if we can open it up just for the last few minutes about the actual process of reflective listening. But if you were actually doing this with someone you were in a room with, like it's a conversation, right? So the reflective listening part is really to make the other person feel heard. But as you are really focusing on your own understanding increasing, questions are absolutely part of that as well. So yeah.
Fantastic. Well, I tell you what, in order to be able to transition into the opening for questions, I'm going to invite everyone to give you a round of applause to say thank you so much, Robin, for coming along and working with us today, because it's fantastic. And also giving us a really practical tool that we can, there's no excuse for us not to be able to use it. I guess it takes practice, but we can go away and use it. So just to open up for any questions, if people have got questions, then either wave at me or pop them into the chat. But what I'm going to do actually is ask our other panelists, do any of you use a form of active listening in what you do? Does anybody use it? So I can see Johannes is nodding. Johannes, do you want to come in on this little discussion now?
Yeah, it's great because in my notes for later today, I've got the reflective listening in the notes, yeah. And it was really nice to hear this explanation to remind me some of the fundamental values of it. Interestingly, I was first taught about reflective listening in Australia by the mining company that hired me as a graduate. And I've always considered that first, and this was before they let me touch any work, yeah. So I've always considered that first training period as almost like a second degree. And very nice to hear that sort of validated with your session. And what I particularly picked up on is the aspect, hearing then Sarah's experience of it, the aspect that when you reflect back, you allow the speaker to change gear, or perhaps to correct themselves, or just to change tone, change depth, etc. So that's really, of course, it's valuable for the listener, but it's also very valuable for the speaker to get this sort of feedback. Nice.
Brilliant. Thanks, Johannes. Robin, did you want to reflect on that?
Well, I think that's a lovely reflection of what we experienced there. I'm just curious about one of the questions, responding to one of the questions that I've seen a couple of times.
Yeah, go for it.
That's all right.
Yeah.
So it was mentioned around, do people get frustrated about the sort of extra length in the conversation? And I think that's possibly the case when you're doing something like an exercise, when you're learning a new technique. But thinking about where you'd actually use this in context, it's actually where you need to have conversations that really matter. And this technique actually enables the person who you're listening to. So it's where you're actually trying to have a conversation with someone who needs you to understand, because something about this really matters to them. And so really being heard actually calms the person down. There's definitely a minute of like, okay, we're slowing this down. We actually want to hear you. So there is a transition, but once, I think, as Sarah found, once you're actually understanding that you're being listened to, you can enter into that deeper level of connection.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Robin. And I'm loving it that lots of people were putting the same question into the chat. And I think with regards to this as well, so it's I suspect, Robin, is an element of technique in terms of the not making it feel like an interruption and actually being able to get in there at a slight lull in somebody's thought process. Is that correct? So it comes with practice.
It does, but I think actually some of it is about breaking the convention that interruption is a terrible thing that you shouldn't do, because I think we've all been in meetings where we just know that the person's just talking because they're kind of going through, they're going through their slides, they've got to get all this information into the space, but actually often that leads to a meeting where nothing productive has actually happened. And prioritizing understanding, yes, it actually can be awkward. But once you've done it a couple of times and you're actually building relationships with the same people will really, really value what you're asking of them, I think.
I'm loving that. So therefore, we've all been given permission to interrupt. Fabulous. Richard, you've got your hand up. On you go.
Yeah, thanks. No, Robin, it's really interesting. I have to say that I've never really done this real time. But I guess what I do a lot with is I listen to students and my students and postdocs. And what we do, if you like, is do that in a closed private space where we'll listen and we'll reflect over them making a presentation before they go out live to the world. Mm. And so we do it that way. And I suppose it takes a bit more brave probably to go out and particularly to do it with someone who's only just beginning to get themselves expressing themselves technically in the open world. And I just don't know at what level do you think you should start to implement this? Because I think for some people who are just starting out, that kind of feedback could actually sort of throw them out, because when we do this in a closed session, it's often people have to go away and reflect, come back and sort of represent. And if you did that in real time, I could see that could actually be quite negative.
Yeah, thanks so much, Richard, and I appreciate what you're saying. I think that what this is best suited for, perhaps, is where are the key relationships between organizations. So good collaboration between organizations is based on particular relationships between particular people. So identifying who those key people are, and then it's about how do you actually build a relationship of trust between those people specifically. So that can happen one-to-one. In fact, it probably normally does happen one-to-one.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, Robin. And thank you as well, Richard, for your reflection in there as well. So with that, everybody, please put your hands together for the wonderful Robin. Brilliant. Round of applause. Fabulous.
Thank you.
So absolute pleasure. So now we're going to move from the fabulous Robin across to the fabulous Priscilla. And Priscilla is going to give us insight to one of those very famous parts of mining, and that is the tailings facility. Now, I'm not going to steal any of Priscilla's thunder, but I'm really excited to hear what you've got to say with regards to building trust with regards to tailings management. So everyone, hands together for the wonderful Priscilla. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Are my slides okay?
Perfect.
Great. So after the discussion we just had, I must warn you that I think with my mouth open. So I think maybe reflective listening might be a challenge for me to do effectively, but I will try. So I'm here to talk about tailings and the basic sense of the problem with tailings. Just considering copper, the annual copper demand is estimated currently at about 28 million tons, and every 1 million tons produces more than 100 million tons of waste. So we're getting billions and billions of tons of tailings that are only going to increase because we're going to lower grade ores and societal demand is increasing. Put it all together, the world has about 30,000 existing active, inactive, and legacy tailings storage facilities. So in fact, the mining industry is in the business of producing tailings, not metals. They're the byproducts. But recently, despite improvements and due attention to people who are doing the designs and the construction, we've had failures. In particular, some amazing ones over the last 5 years, and they will continue into the future, because the reasons for those tailings failures every time seems to be a surprise to the people who have built them. And so we have established a lack of trust of people in the stability of these tailings materials. And the risk of failures is only increasing. The dam heights have been increasing dramatically recently, so that the dams that we're building for the tailings are now higher than any earth embankment water retention dam, and they're expected to go higher. And the risk increases dramatically with time and height. So we've got a lot of opportunities for tailings management. There's some major tsunamis that have to be paid attention to, and the mining industry is dealing with this right now. There's a general demand to minimize the tailings volumes. We have the opportunity for big data and big continuous monitoring and instrumentation. New technologies are coming up all the time. Some of them make sense in the long run, some of them don't. Water is only becoming more important, but the concepts of bringing mining into the circular economy, the stress of critical minerals these days, and the SDG and ESG issues attaining prominence are really critical and the big subject of conversation. So the circular economy opportunity for mining is to really extend the value chain downstream, much as the way, for example, petroleum has extended its value chain downstream with a lot of chemical engineering, a lot of plastics and other materials downstream. But we need to think about this as a drive towards zero waste. And we have to realize that waste is actually an engineering design flaw. So the overall process has a fundamental flaw in it, and we have to recalibrate towards zero waste. Ideally, as we understand what downstream products and markets could develop, the tailings parameters for the best creation of those new products may drive changes back upstream along the geometallurgical flow. So this is a revolutionary concept in mining engineering and mining operations. We really need to understand more about tailings, however, or else we're not going to be able to do this. So I just want to go through a couple of things that we need to do. Tailings characterization needs to be much more thorough, and it's mandatory for zero waste operations. We have temporal and spatial variabilities in the tailings that introduce uncertainties and risks. We need to create data records over the mine history, and we do not have those for materials that have already been placed. If we had real-time characterization, we could support waste stream segregation or partitioning to get even better flow materials into particular downstream operations. And we need to keep our eye on the occurrence, distribution, and sequestration of minerals and elements, including where are those critical materials. Fortunately, we've got a lot of new technology that is getting into a real-time ability to actually see things down to the millimeter and to the micron scale. And that kind of vision and continuous data flow is really important to understand what's going on with the critical minerals. For effective use of tailings, we have to realize that we've got material which is not the same as soils. We haven't done all of our homework as engineers. With the dams getting higher, we need to be able to test to higher stresses. We need to watch for static liquefaction, which has been a not completely understood reason for major dam failures, large strain compressibility, consolidation that really affects the ability to close a mine, and the importance of unsaturated tailing mechanics in the long term. We also add materials to the tailings to get them to settle faster, which introduces an effect on the tailings behavior. We have these new filtered tailings, which have not been completely tested in the laboratory or in the field. And we've also got a lot of mine waste, which is not the same thing as tailings. And we have to look at maybe commingling the tailings with the mine waste. Now you look at the tailings storage facilities, the TSFs, we have to characterize them. Nobody was watching while many of these were done. That photo shows a copper tailings dam in Albania. It is simply waiting to fail. It's had not been watched, not been understood while it was being built. And if we wanted to remine it, I don't know how we would start to do this. So this really needs to be done in order to establish the safety of a mining operation. And this includes understanding how things are spatially variable, including strength and where the seepage is. This means that we have the opportunity to go to platforms which are more airborne and satellite, whether they are one-shot examinations or testing, but ideally towards continuous monitoring, so that every time a storm comes into a particular location, we can understand that storm, the rainfall, and how the dam responds to the rainfall to understand exactly how the dam is behaving. And this means that we need to stretch over to underused methods, including geophysics, thermal, and multispectral on a more common basis. So we can go to, how do we get to zero waste at this point? There's a number of ways that we're investigating at the Tailings Center at Colorado School of Mines, including in situ or selective mining and changes in the processing, disposal on site, particularly underground, repurposing the mine itself, but really using the tailings becomes important. And that's what I'm going to make a few additional comments about. So new materials. Right now, there's a lot of people doing one-off studies on how you could use tailings. We've got some interesting papers that have come out recently on biosynthesis or bio-nano mining, where you actually can create nanosilicates or nano copper, which can be used in catalysis or in other manufacturing operations. And then we have sand, cement, geopolymerization, foam, and glass. Well, the world is running out of sand. You may not know that, but we make a lot of concrete. Vale down in Brazil has actually separated the sand from their rest of their tailings and is actually marketing it now as a construction material. People are studying the use of tailings as substitutes in concrete. And you may not know this, but concrete is the second most consumed substance on Earth after water. The annual use rate of concrete is expected to rise to more than 15 tons per person per year by 2050, and we have very little recycling. So you can think that somewhere in the world, there's 15 tons every year placed in your name. Many tailings types may be substituted, but we need to understand the chemistry and the mineralogy in order to use this in a reliable system to reduce the global emissions of CO2, which are always associated with the manufacture of cement. We can think up new manufactured materials, for example, geopolymers, where we have alkali activation, which actually transforms aluminosilicate materials so that they actually form their own cement without cement. And we can use these to make construction materials. Of course, transport costs may limit the market, and mines are usually in relatively remote locations. A relatively new development is to actually create geofoams, which are primarily used for insulation, very low density, and they're actually been 3D printed to actually create specialized insulation for operations. They seem to be better at immobilizing heavy metals, which is a good thing when we're trying for long-term performance. Something that particularly excites me is the idea of making glass. Fiberglass is made from glass silica sand, melted very high and then cooled quickly to prevent crystallization. And this has been done for about the last 100 years. During that period of time, people were also paying attention to melting rock, in particular basalt. There's an explosion of basaltic magma, which creates natural fibers during the explosive process. And people in Ukraine, Russia, China, there's a company in Ireland, and also on Iceland, they've been working with making these basalt fibers. The process for making basalt fibers is a good deal simpler than carbon fiber or the glass fibers. All you do is melt the basalt. You still have to control the chemistry, so you have to understand it. And you can buy basalt fiber products on eBay. In the lower left, we have rebars, and that is the reinforcement for concrete. which is particularly interesting because this material does not corrode, and corrosion is one of the major sources of failure of reinforced concrete structures, causing the need for their replacement. So if we can melt basalt, we can melt tailings, maybe with concentrated solar at the mine site, but we need to be able to control what the mineralogy, the chemistry, and the thermodynamics of the tailing stream is. So now we can briefly talk about remining and reprocessing, and particularly looking at critical minerals. We know that critical minerals exist in mine tailings, but they've been not recovered, and we don't know what is where and how much there is and what the value is. So we're doing a study right now at Colorado School of Mines, where we're considering 3 scenarios for critical mineral supply. The first one I have here is recovery of historic waste, that's from tailings. We also are looking at new main product operations, byproducts from existing mines, and we're also aware of recycling and are tracking that, but that's not main focus of our study. We're trying to compare these different scenarios in terms of resource efficiency, sustainable development, and environmental justice. And this requires us to have a research team, which is quite different from what you'd normally see coming out of an engineering school like Colorado School of Mines. This is the team, and you can see straight off, these are the principal investigators. 7 of the 10 are women. We are working with cultural anthropologists. Nicole Smith is actually one of the first people I hired when I was department head. There aren't too many mining departments that have a cultural anthropologist on their staff. And we involve ore geology and policy people and mineral economics. So it's a very exciting project. We have a case study basis, including industry partners, working with Bunker Hill up in Idaho and in Red Dog, Alaska. And we also have industry partnerships in Idaho and Minnesota for new main products and for byproducts with Nevada Gold, and we're still growing the partnerships there. For example, the case study underway at Red Dog, Alaska, we are taking tailing samples and accessing the old ones, really trying to figure out exactly what is where in this material and how and whether it can be recovered. This means that we're actually looking at the deportment of where is gallium, where's germanium, where is indium in this material, because by and large, the mining companies have not been looking for this material in the past. So we're working with Red Dog to really develop a concept for a modified decommissioning plan associated with tailings remining, which is the E, environmental, community perception of reprocessing for critical minerals. There's a lot of native corporations around, so we have to deal with the social aspects. And then techno-economic regulatory policy assessment, which is critical in this area, which is dealing with governance issues. So I think overall in the US, we are coming to an understanding that permitting a new mining project seems to be very difficult, even unlikely, even without considering the issues embedded in ESG and SDG. And it seems that globally the question is becoming which countries will pay the social and environmental costs required to meet the global critical metal demand. So in our project, we're studying how these impacts may be differentially distributed across landscapes, countries, communities, and populations in general, as we advocate for it to be considered as a holistic perspective, incorporating resource efficiency, sustainable development, and environmental justice. We're about a little under 2 years into the project, and we expect to have 3 more years to actually build those partnerships and reach a point where we have more concrete recommendations to make, particularly regarding the policy and the regulatory issues. So I thank you very much, and I'd be happy to have any questions anybody wants.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Priscilla. As always, truly brilliant. Round of applause for Priscilla, everyone. Brilliant. So Priscilla, quick question from me, and actually building on what Robin was talking about earlier. So the department looks fantastic, and I especially love the mix of skill sets and background and expertise that's in there. At the moment, a number of us who I know are in the meeting, we're part of a similar kind of research group where we've got people who are very, very experienced on, say, the social side or the cultural aspects. And then you've got some of the world's nerdiest geeks with regards to geology. How do you find bringing those individuals together? Like, does the cultural anthropologist and the geeky geologist or engineer, do they work? Like, do they listen to one another, or are there any parts where they kind of miss one another's meaning?
Yeah, so this is a project funded by the U.S. National Science Foundation that really focuses on what is called growing convergent research. So we talk a lot about convergence, getting to the point where we actually can understand first the language. What is the vocabulary? Because that can cause an initial problem in actually clearly understanding what each other's saying. But for me, and this is the role that I play in this project, is I've sort of evolved this vision of where we're going. And I tell people that if you ever forget where we're going altogether, just ask me and we'll pull the vision out and talk about it again and and revise it as it's growing. It's a living concept, but I'm the one who has all those little conversations with everybody and keeps the connections going, keeps the cross questions happening. So we actually build ourselves a network. And this is coming out very strongly because we're also developing undergraduate and graduate courses that are associated with this. And in partnership with a school called Fort Lewis College, which is down in Durango, Colorado, which is predominantly, it's not an engineering school and has a lot of, I'd say, Native American backgrounded people in the school. And when you put Colorado School of Mines students together with that group, boy, do you have a conversation, because there's totally different perspectives in terms of what the mineral resources are for and the stewardship of the earth, which is what I think the mining engineers and the tailing engineers have to be in the future. Stewards. They're not primarily engineers, they're primarily stewards.
Brilliant. Thank you, Priscilla. Now we've got a flurry of questions that are beginning to come in at the moment. I'm going to ask you some of them, but some of them we might need to keep to just being answered through typing. But so James has asked a great one in the Q&A. And James asks, has your group examined using mine tailings for enhanced weathering and carbon dioxide removal?
Yes, of course. We're very aware of, but most of the work has been focused on ultramafic rocks. And they weather very fast. So it's an accelerating weathering process that actually precipitates the carbonate mineral as a stable form. So we are not doing this, but I am trying to get microbiologists to actually figure out how to accelerate the weathering of feldspars that are in higher silicate materials, like the porphyries that are mined for many of the metals. It's an accelerated weathering, but we need microbial assists. So I think, in fact, it's going to be extremely exciting. Mining could be the savior of the world if we can figure this out.
There we go. I think that is an awesome place to leave it, Priscilla. You've got offerings of collaboration coming through in the chat. It's absolutely glorious. And also there's some awesome work just on the carbon chat that we just had just now. There's some work, great work that's been done at the University of Strathclyde here in the UK with regards to that recently as well. So Priscilla, thank you so much. Absolutely brilliant. Round of applause. Yay. Awesome. Okay, so we're going to go from Colorado School of Mines across to Germany and of course Austria. And I'm going to welcome to our virtual stage the fantastic Johannes and Volker. So if we can please put our hands together for these two wonderful individuals while Johannes shares his screen, and I shall hand it over to the two of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Oh, and Johannes, you might be on the old mute button.
Sorry about that. Thanks,
Perfect.
Sarah. Yep. I was ready to start with an introduction, but I think you've got our bios on the website, right?
Yep.
But so in very short order, I'm an environmental engineer with a history of leading multidisciplinary teams. And I wanted to talk today about my experience in consensus building and to introduce my business partner, Volker, as well, to a systemic consensing decision-making method that was invented by Volker's business. And we're working together to bring this more and more to the mining industry and elsewhere. And I think it's relevant because, as the conference says, we need to agree common objectives, respect each other enough to explore assumptions and options, and make timely decisions if we're going to make this transition and if we're going to have the raw materials to do so. And hopefully by this process, we can also sow some seeds of trust. So then a little word about what we believe facilitation is. Okay, so facilitating means supporting a group of people to achieve their goals. So normally as facilitators, we try to be independent within a change process, a workshop, a project, or a meeting. Typically for me, over the course of my career, it's involved establishing a framework or a structure. Perhaps sometimes it required gaining top management support for the group so that they could feel empowered to decide. It requires active, reflective listening, cultural awareness, keen observation also of body language, and often some amount of translation between disciplines, like Sarah, you mentioned, between maybe the economic theologist and the social scientist. And often enough in my career, I have found myself seemingly translating, I joke and say, translating from English to English. And I think it's part of that reflective listening, just to make sure that even if I think I've understood the participant, maybe some assistance is required to make sure the rest of the room understands the participant. And sometimes the facilitation team may build a unique overview of the topic or the issues at hand. And depending on the topic, depending on the context, that the facilitation team might develop that view, but not be in a position to unilaterally reveal that view to individual participants. So facilitation can become quite a privileged role. And in that sense, the facilitator needs to be trusted. So then I think I'll hand over to Volker and he'll explain a little bit more about the method that we use to facilitate these decisions.
Thank you. Systemic consensus is a decision-making process, and its goal is to find a solution that is sustainable and that is can be accepted by everybody who has participated in this process. So it's not about, like we sometimes know, find a big group that says yes and the other group has to accept. No, it's about finding a solution that can be accepted by all the participants. And it's a systemic innovation. And what I want to explain that most of the decision-making processes we know weren't designed. They just grew. They were suddenly there, and then now we use them in all our contexts as we know. And some of them have a very bad systemic impact on the behavior of the group. And what do I mean with the word systemic? I have these two pictures here. One is from a soccer game and the other one is from figure skating. People align their behavior to the success criteria of the system they are in. So this is why you have never seen figure skaters spit on the ground, because they are judged, or their success criteria is to be elegant. On the other side, the soccer player, he's only judged by shooting more goals than the other team. It's the only thing is that's his success criteria, and all his behavior is aligned and focused on this thing. So if we have systems in which our success criteria, and the only success criteria, I'm now referring to the majority vote, is find a bigger group behind you than any other group, and then you're successful, our whole behavior is aligning to this. And this is what we can see in the politics and everywhere where majority vote is used. This is the behavior of the people. And it's not find the best solutions for all, because it's not my success criteria. My success criteria is find a bigger group behind me. And by changing this success criterion to something else, so what we do in systemic consensus is we measure resistance, find a solution nobody has resistance against, so they can all live with it. They have to change their behavior. to a totally different, open to consensus, open to listening to the needs of others. Because if I don't put your needs in my solution, you will have resistance against my solution. So it's totally changing the way people behave, and we are not kind of oh, please, you good boys and good girls, please behave. No, if you want to be successful, you will behave this way. And this is a big change. And this is why it's a systemic innovation, and it's a new kind of putting forward solutions that come close to consensus. Yeah, this back to you, Johannes.
Thank you. And I wanted to explain that this is a real life experience that we have when facilitating these groups. And my most recent experience was with a colleague of ours facilitating a decision process within the Global Battery Alliance. And it was very obvious that in setting the framework, the behavior of the participants changed. When you think about it, if you give any sort of slightly competitive activity amongst children or families, people immediately want to understand the rules. I know that when my 11-year-old says, can we play this big elaborate game, I straight away am asking, what are the rules? And that's because people are trying to decide how will they behave? How will they behave in that activity? And we have observed this also in the Global Battery Alliance. Individual participants wish to understand particularly how the final decision will be. What are the rules of the game that they're in? And very often human beings will look for ways to game the system to their advantage. They'll try to exploit something within the rules to give them some advantage in the decision making. Like Volker mentioned, if it's majority rule, well, I just lobby some people to get a larger group. Sometimes it can mean that they've misunderstood their context. For example, a very ruthless assembling of a majority to make a decision that leaves a minority feeling hardly done by, that could be hard enough to break a relationship. So sometimes people need to be reminded that might not be in their interest. They may be seeking a longer term relationship, and so then they should think a little more about how hard to push the rules. But then, as Volker explained, if we set the rules so that this human tendency can be gainfully employed, then we can actually start to align incentives. There's something else that I think we saw from the previous discussion, where the human behavior, the desire to succeed, the desire to do well in the activity can naturally align. For example, if the combined objective is to lower the overall resistance to the decision being made. Volker, I think you can explain to us why.
Why do we measure resistance? So I will start with here I see a quote from my father: respect for a human being is shown in the respect for his or her no. So this is one thing we believe in. If somebody says no and you don't respect this no, you don't respect a person at all. So this is really, you can see it in this. But I want to put forward another quote I heard from a very famous trainer for nonviolent communication. He once said, aggression is a strategy that people choose when they are afraid that their needs will not be met. So resistance is always a hint for a need that hasn't been met. And if my needs aren't to be fulfilled, or I'm in a context where I'm in fear that my needs are not fulfilled, I start to put forward fighting or something else strategies, kind of. So normally we go back to what's in English, stem brain stem, where only fight and flight is active. And when the stem brain is active, the parts of the brain that are used for social interaction or creativity, they cannot be active at the same time. So you're in a fight mode and not in a creative mode. And if you're in a system that says, hey, your resistance, your no is important to us, And we will always have a look at this, and we will try our best to fulfill your needs. This is our systemic goal. People start to change their behavior. They start to relax. They come in a state to be more creative. I also heard once a trainer, he said the main thing a facilitator should do, he should provide a safe environment. When we were 1,000 years ago, always one was standing there and having watched that no wild animal would come and eat us, so the others could relax. And this is kind of the role of a facilitator, to make sure that you others can relax, because only in relaxed states you can be creative and open to consensus and open to social interaction. So we put a whole system around this that will focus on providing a safe space in which your needs, the goal is that the needs of all the participants should be met. This is our goal, and this is the basis for our decision. And this changes the whole process of decision making. Johannes.
Right, so I really want to leave some time so that people can quiz us. So I'll just wrap up with some familiar diagrams for some. These are attempts that the industry's made in the past to define social license to operate. And I think that literature tells us that establishing trust is not a one-step process. It's a step-by-step process, and there might even be some prerequisites that need to be established before you can establish trust. And when in this systemic consenting method, of course, the proof has to come in the pudding. So once the decision is made, and what we generally see is that once a decision is made with systemic consenting, minimizing resistance to that decision, the proof is in the implementation. So if everyone is on board, everyone has been heard, everyone has had their resistance dealt with, it's maybe not a complete lack of resistance, but at least minimized resistance, there's much better chance that people will buy into that decision, they will stand for that decision, and they will contribute to implementing that decision. And then when you start to establish a track record of the group, that's when you can establish credibility of yourself as individuals, credibility of the process, and start perhaps to establish the seeds of trust. And then I'm very keen to field any questions.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Johannes and Volker, for that. We're going to give you a round of applause to say thank you, just straight off the bat, because I think that was a fantastic talk. And also, I guess, building on what we've heard earlier on today, be it from Robin on that listening perspective or that side of things, and then Priscilla digging into one of those key areas within the mining sector that has had huge problems with regards to that. So Johannes and Volker, with regards to the techniques that you've been sharing with us here today, so you've been applying them within the battery passport, is that correct, Johannes? And then how about with regards to the broader, say the European context? Because Europe is really interesting in that there's not a huge amount of mining that goes on, but there's quite a lot of social sentiment with regards to the mining sector. So Johannes, I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Well, just to say that I agree with you that there's huge potential, and maybe you've guessed at one of my motivations for really starting to develop this side of our service offering. So Volker and our partner Dominic are very experienced in providing this sort of services in the German-speaking world, and now we're teaming up to provide an English format for this, and especially see a large market for this in the multi-stakeholder groups that inevitably meet in places like Brussels and Paris and Geneva to deal with some of these issues and try to develop documents or develop decisions, etc., etc. But eventually, if you really wanted to be creative and brave and innovative, you could imagine bringing such processes into committees of Parliament, for example, because the Parliament has its own rules that drives its own behaviours. A certain number of those rules are based on a majority vote. But you might even be able to carve out a sandbox or a space where you say, okay, in this context for this negotiation, we are going to apply resistance rating, systemic and such things. See if we can't get to a better amendment or a better compromise. So that's a long way off, but there is application for this in the political sphere, and I know that they've done. My colleagues have done some work in the political sphere in Austria. Volker, if you want to add. It looks like.
Oh, he might have frozen.
Okay.
Yeah.
Actually, in Austria and in the German-speaking world, kind of, we are working.
Keep going, Volker. On you go.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes. On you go. You're just a little bit cyborg.
In the German-speaking world. Okay, I'm sorry. We already got some villages really using the method of systemic consensus for their whole decision taking, really on a political level. So in Austria, we already have experience with this.
And so with this, do you find that because again, Johannes, going back to that kind of that macro perspective and thinking about this in parliaments, etc., where you've got lots of different cultures coming together, do you find that this form of understanding and listening, etc., works better in some cultures than others, or do you find that you just have to push it a little bit further when you've got multiple different cultures coming together? Does that make any sense?
It makes sense. It's a fair question. The answer I would give is I suspect that the human behaviors that we're tapping into here are universal. But what might be important is a culture fit between the facilitator and the main players, or at least a cultural awareness so that the facilitator can help people to bridge these cultural differences. And that does take time. So this method is adaptable. We can compress it. If you need to make a decision, Sarah, by the end of tomorrow, we can take you through a much more rigid, perhaps even a little bit directive version of the method, which nevertheless still does get people to reduce resistance. And I think some of our panelists have seen me in action in that mode. But if you really do want to take the time to better bridge cultural differences and better establish an understanding behind the resistance, then of course it's better to take more time to run that process.
Fantastic. Awesome. So thank you. There are more questions, by the way, beginning to come in. I'll try and make sure we feed them through to both of you. But Johannes, Volker, thank you so much for sharing with us today. Round of applause. Awesome.
Thanks,
fantastic. So that then takes brilliant. Thank you very much, Volker. So that then takes us into our next talk that we've got this afternoon, and that is Adrian Joseph, who is going to join us. And I don't know, Adrian Joseph, if you have any slides or if you just want to speak to us. Excellent. Now is a good moment for you to hit those buttons. And so Adrian Joseph is going to speak to us about on a number of different aspects, but I think builds on everything that we've heard already this afternoon, because I'm going to let you introduce yourself as well, sir, by the way. As you can see from the picture on the virtual wall behind his head, he comes from the Impact Negotiation Group. And so I think this is going to be really interesting to hear your talk. So Adrian Joseph, over to yourself. Round of applause.
Thank you very much, Sarah. So my name is Adrian. As mentioned before, for the people that maybe weren't there, I'm a partner at Impact Negotiation Group. And I'm just going to bring up my slides so you get a bit of an idea on the company I'm working for. If everything goes well, you should. Yes, Thank you, Sarah. So we're a relatively young company, founded by a few of my partners. We used to work together in a previous company. We're basically a consultancy specialized in negotiations, more specifically commercial negotiations. We do a lot of end-to-end support of negotiations using our consulting services. This can be cross-industry. We have a methodology that we apply and tailor to different industries. Sometimes, as many of the panelists here, we organize behavioral development workshops. and a lot of on-the-job embedding to make sure the learnings stay on longer. We operate across Europe, UK, and the US in 4 different languages. So I'm going to take you to the heart of our business, which is a tool that we use in every day, which we call the Impact Negotiation Gauge. Now, this is a tool that we use to understand what type of negotiation we're about to enter. And generally speaking, what the prerequisites are for these negotiations. Following those prerequisites, what would be the appropriate behavior one must show in order to maximize the outcome of this deal. And I'll go in more detail in a moment. For now, just want your attention on competitive and collaborative. So when we look at a very simplistic view of a negotiation, we can think of it as a pie. Using the pie analogy, we can as the value that is present in a specific deal, we have a fixed pie analogy, which means we're basically negotiating one another in a zero-sum type of environment, where what I lose, you win, and what you lose, I win. This is typically what we call a competitive negotiation. And on the other hand, we have a pie, but this one not a fixed pie. Actually, by coming together, we're able to increase the value because things like trust, things like time, a few prerequisites are in place, and that would allow us to be more of a collaborative negotiation. So these are 2 big differences in the world where I'm from, because unless you understand this, it's going to be a very difficult exercise to negotiate, not knowing whether you're going into a competitive or collaborative. I won't go into too much detail right now, but it's a very interesting aspect if anybody wants to discuss further. So coming back to negotiation gauge, I'm going to go through a few definitions, and then we'll build from there on the trust part and why that's, in my sector, very, very important. So from a competitive side, if we look at an auction, typical prerequisites for an auction to exist is multiple buyers and sellers available, a very clearly defined scope, and clearly defined way to compare and assess different buyers or sellers. Moving on to distribution. A distribution type of negotiation, a buyer wants to buy, a seller wants to sell. Not much more than that. Then we go into enhancement. An enhancement, we're starting to enter in the more collaborative space. And typically a prerequisite needed there is a little bit more flexibility on the other party, some more openness, and sufficient time. And then lastly, we get to collaborative negotiation, and specifically a creation negotiation, where prerequisites are creativity, even greater flexibility, greater openness, transparency, sufficient joint time, and willingness from both parties. Now, only when these prerequisites are met can we judge for ourselves whether we're in an enhancement, an auction, or a distribution type of negotiation. Either way, we need to decide proactively whether we can influence that, and we do that by applying specific behaviors. On the competitive side, a way to maximize the deal and make sure that prerequisites are not in place, if they are, is a short, firm, distant, resolute, closed, and direct behavior. This is behavior that will allow you to maximize a deal in a competitive type of environment. When we look at a more collaborative deal, so again, looking at pie becoming bigger, appropriate behavior that allows you to maximize a deal there is more warm, open-minded, flexible, and you see this one coming, trustworthy, cooperative, and exploring. And so trustworthy is a relatively small aspect of the behavior that you see here on the slide, but a very, very big one, because it can have a lot of consequences on, well, the size of the pie that you'll be negotiating. So I'm going to give credit where credit is due, because trust as a topic, we discuss it a lot. A lot of our customers, well, it varies who finds it more or less important, depending on the type of negotiation they're about to enter. But for the ones that do find it important, it's a very big topic. So we don't only use our knowledge. We're very big fans of Stephen Covey and his book on speed of trust, which is something that we use in order to educate our customers on how to create more trustful relationships. So one thing to understand about negotiation is that negotiation is a form of conflict resolution. Yeah, one person wants this, the other person wants that. And basically, we are in a state of conflict to a certain extent. And you get a lot of resistance, you get a lot of no's, and you're trying to resolve that conflict together. But by default, it makes people relatively uncomfortable. People don't necessarily like conflict. And in our business, we know best negotiators are people that embrace this notion of conflict. Rare are those people that wake up in the morning and think, hey, today I'm going to generate some conflict. It's not really a thing. So because it's typically uncomfortable, creating a trustful or having some trustworthy behavior, trustful environment is not all that easy, which is why it's an important topic. So let's talk about trust. In my presentation, I'm going to use a bunch of quotes because I really like quotes. You'll see my presentation is filled with them. So the reason I use it is because I'm always inspired by these. And well, I like how it makes you think. So what is trust? And seeing as I love quotes, and I just said it, I rarely look at the dictionary specifically, but I use quotes of others. So Jack Welch talks about trust saying, you know it when you feel it. And for a lot of people, it's this thing that you can't really put a value to it. Huh? Some people say trust is confidence. But a clear one is the opposite of trust is distrust. And that one usually equals suspicion. And this one, a lot of people understand. When you trust people, you have confidence in them, in their integrity and their abilities. And when you distrust people, you're suspicious of them, of their intentions, of their integrity, their agenda, their capabilities, or their track record. So when we look at negotiating without trust, which I'm going to say more than 50% of my customers do these type of negotiations. Negotiation without trust, it's not all that great. Why? Well, for one, it's costly. If you don't trust one another, you're going to have to put a lot of penalty clauses in place in case of non-performance because, you got to write and assess the risks that are happening. It's going to be difficult to create value. Generally speaking, in order to create value together, you need to get an understanding of each other's priorities, get an understanding of what someone finds important. But that's going to be very limited. If there's no trust, people are going to hold their cards very close to their chest. It's going to be more complex. Many more stakeholders will like to get involved, again, to assess these risks and cover accordingly. And it usually takes more time. People are often considered suspicious when there's no trust involved, and therefore they will always try to push for more, not knowing whether they got the best out of that deal. Here comes a quote. You can't draw up an agreement thick enough for people you don't trust. I think this is a great one, right? Without trust, it's going to be pages and pages and pages of clauses, of things you need to cover yourself for. So on creating trust, when we look at trust, and again, credit where credit is due, Stephen Covey, big fan, it follows a very specific pattern, a chain, if you will. And it starts not at the easiest place, but with self-trust. Starts with self-trust and then moves on to relationship trust. Yeah? That's you towards the other. From relationship trust, it moves to organizational trust. And from organizational trust, it moves to market trust. All right. So let's start with self-trust. And for self-trust, I'm going to use the analogy of a tree. So looking at a tree and looking at self-trust is often, I think, used with credibility. Yeah. So self-trust, credibility, whether a person is credible or not. So if you can't trust yourself, you can't really expect others to do so. And being credible towards others is a first step in building trust. And in doing that, in that self-trust, we want to make a distinction between two big parts, which one is the lower part of the tree, which is character. And then you have the upper part of the tree, which is competence. And the lower part of the tree in that character, it starts with integrity. And integrity, it's basically the tree's roots, and it encompasses the things you do when nobody's watching. Yeah. But it also means if you actually do what you advise others to do. That's a very simple one. If you're the type of person that advises people to work out, but you don't really yourself, well, what does that say about your integrity? A lot of people think integrity about just being honest, but that's only one element about it. It's also about being congruent and about walking the talk. It's the courage of acting according, well, to your beliefs and your own values, and whether you hold others to the same standard as you hold yourself. Then we move up the tree from the roots to the tree trunk. That's intent. And intent has to do with motives, our agenda. And typically, if we are, well, if we're acting in a mutual interest, if we're driving our own agenda, or we're driving our mutual agenda, we're doing something for you and me, trying to benefit each other. What is the intent you have here? What is the motive you're going into a negotiation with for? Then we move up one bit, and that goes into the, let's say, the branches of the tree. That's your capability. And that's all about the means we have to produce results, your skills, your knowledge, your attitude. Oftentimes, capability can be used to restore trust. You know, if you're very capable and you show good results, you can restore trust relatively quickly. Then you have the results, which in essence are the fruits of the tree, our track record, our performance and ability to get things done. So when we look at increasing self-trust, how do we go about that? Well, when we look at integrity specifically, try and make and keep commitments to yourself. And I see that, and diving into the subject just recently again for this presentation, one of the things that we often do is set maybe unrealistic goals for ourselves. For example, I did that, I think 2 months ago. I thought, okay, I'm going to quit sugar altogether. That's a big commitment. And what happens, because it's such a big challenge, because it's pretty up there, you end up not hitting, or at least not being able to commit to that specific challenge, because you're going to have some sugar going around somewhere. You get very disappointed with yourself. So it's better to look at consistency. So trying to basically, instead of getting rid of sugar altogether, say I'm going to get rid of sugar twice a week. Small things, small steps, but be consistent. So you can basically rely on yourself, on keeping commitments to yourself and slowly building that up. But consistency is everywhere. So start small. Same with exercises. If you think about going and not working out to working out, don't set yourself a goal of 3 times a week. Start with once a week. Hold that once a week as much as you can, staying consistent. Maybe even think of twice a week to be able to hit that goal of once a week and hold on to that. That will have an exponential effect on your own sense of integrity. Stand for something. I think that kind of speaks for itself. And be open. Yeah. And this can be a difficult one, but it's really about being open to other perspectives, other people's opinions, and willing to change your mind and be influenced by them. Yeah. And then we have intent. And intent, we can increase intent by Well, do something with motive. Yeah, motive is why people do things. You can increase it by genuinely caring, or at least saying that you care. Yeah. If you genuinely don't care, you're going to leave a lot of trust on the table. So try and showing you care, showing that you have a mutual agenda. Don't put only your points on the agenda, put their points too. And think of behavior. Yeah, people judge our motives and our agenda on our behavior. So poor behavior can lead to poor execution of intent. All right. Now for a quote. The only thing worse than a coach or CEO that doesn't care is one who pretends to care. So we've talked about self-trust. Let's move on to relationship trust. So relationship trust, that's, you have self-trust first, then you have relationship trust. And to start off with a quote, high performance perceive distrust as an insult. This will lead to high turnover and employees leaving to organizations where they can't be trusted. So might be worth considering it. Relationship trust all comes down to very specific behaviors. 13 behaviors to be exact. One is talk straight, demonstrate respect, create transparency. I'll let you read them. Well, actually, don't even read them, because for the sake of time, I'm going to go through every one of them. So I'm just going to go through them. So, talking straight. Don't leave false impression, tell the truth, use simple language, and call things as they are. What upsets me is not that you lied to me, it's that I no longer can believe you. Yeah, from Nietzsche. Demonstrate respect. I think that's a simple one. You can judge a person's character by the way he treats people who can't help or hurt him. How do people treat waiters? How do people treat their taxi drivers? Create transparency. Try to be transparent, clear, and truthful, even when it's difficult, and above all, when it is difficult, from Jean-Cyril Spinetta. This is great. This is basically the opposite of having hidden agendas, secrecy, withholding, hidden meanings, hidden objectives. Want to avoid that. Right wrongs. Yeah, to know what it is, to know what is right and not do it is the worst cowardice. Right wrongs. In righting wrongs, it's important to be quick and going the extra mile. Yeah, don't just right or rectify a mistake you've done. Do a little bit extra. Show loyalty. Give credit where credit is due. Deliver results. Speaks for itself. Get better. The world changes. If we don't get better, we actually deteriorate. And one of the reasons people stop learning is that they become less and less willing to risk failure. Confront reality. Confront reality is basically take issues head on. Yeah? Don't leave them hanging. Clarify expectations. Now, this is a very important one. What's to clarify? Oh, yeah. You went over budget on this project. Over budget? What do you mean over budget? We only went 1% over budget. Well, 1%. In a lot of industries, 1% of our budget is not over budget. And some, it is. So be very clear on your expectations. Yeah. Almost all conflict is a result of violated expectations. Practice accountability. Start with yourself, then others. Listen first and speak last. I won't elaborate on this one because I think we've heard in the first presentation a lot on listening. Keep commitments. It's a big kahuna of trust builders. Extending trust. It's based on the idea of reciprocity. If you start trusting them, it's a big chance they'll start trusting you. This is from Berkshire Hathaway. By the standards of the rest of the world, we overtrust. So far, it has worked very well for us. So Berkshire Hathaway, they managed with their company 377,000 people with a staff of 25. They work on trust. Oh. Okay, I'm seeing I'm a minute over time, so I'm just going to accelerate a little bit. Okay. Actually, I'm just going to skip a few slides for the sake of time. Apologies. Let's have a little
You're
interaction.
okay, Adrian. We will find the time later, so just keep going. That's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Great. I had a few backups to skip, but okay, if I'm okay, then I'm okay. In that case, a question to you. Take a moment to think on how you would describe a low trust organization. Take a few minutes. How would that look like, a low trust organization? Not a few minutes, Sarah, 20 seconds.
Okay, we haven't quite got that much time, Adrian.
Yeah, no. So typically what comes to mind is people manipulating information or new ideas being openly resisted. People finding getting the credit being very important, people spinning the truth. Mistakes are being covered up. Many discussions are considered undiscussable. A lot of blame game, many violated expectations, many meetings after meetings. Yeah, so yeah, stay here. We have some more to over promises and under delivery, low energy levels, and people often feeling unproductive. Now, how do you create a high trust organization? Well, do the opposite of that. It's quite simple. So going back to self-trust, relationship trust, moving on to organizational trust. When trust is absent in an organization, you can see it. More checks, more controls and process, which we call bureaucracy. Going down to a quote, low trust breeds bureaucracy and bureaucracy breeds low trust. In low trust organization, bureaucracy is everywhere. So how to increase organizational trust comes back to our tree. And here as well, integrity. Do we know what we stand for? Do we have a culture of honesty? Do we make and admit mistakes? And if we want to increase it, do we have an organizational mission? Can we engage everyone in conversation to make everybody on board with our values? You know how often values are changed around? You should ask yourself the question whether everybody's on board with those specific values. Intent, do we have a culture of caring? Or are we just out to make a profit? And if we want to increase it, do we have systems in place that reward mutual benefits, collaboration instead of competitive behavior? Capability, do we have the right people? And are we attracting them? Results, are we able to deliver results we promised that people can rely on us? When employees aren't trusted, they pass on the lack of trust to their customers, and customers in turn leave. And this is really going back to relationship trust, organizational trust. Well, the last part is over there. And if you don't trust your own people, well, probably their customers won't trust them either, and customers will leave. So in the end, all you have is your reputation. So when we look at trust, there's a chain, and it ends up being market trust. And there we come back to our tree again. Are we seen as an honest company? Are we perceived as people that care? Do people associate us with excellence, continuous improvement, ability to change, and do our people deliver? So this is a combination of factors. If we are only integer and have good intentions, but we're incapable, it's not going to work. And if we're very result-driven and very capable, but we have bad intentions, it's also not going to work. So and this is an important one. There are no facts, only interpretation. So you can do a lot of things, but if people interpret it the wrong way, it's not going to work. So restoring trust, easy. Look at the 13 behaviors. Now, when you look at the 13 behaviors, you start there. And then think of self-trust, relationship trust, organizational trust, and market trust. But it all starts with self-trust. And that's the most difficult one. If you can't trust yourself, showing integrity, following up on commitments, listening, getting better, creating transparency, and so forth. If self-trust is not set, then the rest doesn't matter. And this is me talking straight. So what now? Well, the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. And the second best time is today. So we're negotiators. Yeah, we're specialist negotiators. And important things about being able to increase the pie over here, and where the pie gets bigger, is where there's high levels of trust, or as a minimum, to appear or to be interpreted as very trustworthy. That was it. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Adrian, for that. Round of applause, everybody, for the fantastic Adrian. And I'm glad you did take us through the rest of those slides. Unfortunately, we don't have time for verbal questions, but if people have got questions for Adrian, please do feel free to pop them into the chat. And I think there was so much that resonated for me during your talk just now, and I will be going back and watching it again. But that quote that you used to say that when trust is absent in an organization, you can see it through all those checks, controls, process, i.e. the bureaucracy. And I think certainly some of the large organizations that I get to work with on a daily basis, that's exactly what has been built with regards to that. So Adrian, thank you so much. Round of applause. Absolutely brilliant.
Thank you.
Fantastic. So that then takes us on into the next presentation, which is where I've already placed my bet that Richard is going to mention that word biodiversity pretty early on. So Richard, if you are there, do you want to turn on your camera and your microphone? I can see that you're sharing your screen. This is amazing. I'm loving the order in which you're clicking those buttons. I will let you share your slides first, and then we'll make sure that we can hear you. Beautiful. We can see your slides, but we can't see you, and we can't hear you. Otherwise, I could talk to your slides. That would be fascinating, wouldn't it?
Well, it could be, Sarah, and you probably make more sense than
I don't know.
than I will. And you've already stolen the biodiversity wonder. Well, it's in the title. Yeah. So I'm actually thanks for the platform. Really interesting talks to date, and I'm going to follow on from this trust subject, and I think hopefully you'll see that it's quite a good segue into what I'm going to talk about. So we're talking about a project that I'm at the Natural History Museum in London, but I'm working part of an international project that involves groups including Natural History Museum, where we have geoscientists and biologists, and we are working with colleagues at Imperial College, and then several groups in the Philippines, particularly in Mindanao and in Manila. And what we're actually looking at is how can we develop ways of what we're calling biopositive mining that is actually socially inclusive. And I'm going to talk a bit about our project, which is actually funded through the Global Centre on Biodiversity for Climate, which is an initiative from DEF, for the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs in the UK, and they're working to look at projects that are helping to deliver the arresting climate change, but also looking at nature positive and biodiversity positive project. So hopefully you'll get a flavour for that as we go on. So moving to the next slide, the first. We moved on. Yeah, we have. So I'm not going to read through it totally, but the rationale for this project is there is a closed mine in northern Luzon. It's an old porphyry copper mine called Santo Niño, which mined several 100 million tons of low-grade copper ore in a block caving project. And it was closed in 1982 at the time when mine closure plans weren't really necessary. And the company actually walked away from this one. So the legacy is an abandoned copper mine with a negative surface legacy of an abandoned and degrading infrastructure, waste rock, and a tailings facility that were left. And the local, largely indigenous community moved back in to do agriculture as they would, because this is a highly populated area. The mining was carried on in the community here. Obviously, the loss of the mine meant people had to go back to other jobs, and a lot of them went back to subsistence farming. But obviously, with the legacy of this mine, it left a big sort of negative hole in the community. So the aims of our project were, and we put this front and center was to engage with all stakeholders, and in particular here, it's the indigenous people in the community. Now, it's under Philippines law, if you work in areas that is under the jurisdiction of indigenous peoples, you have to have that agreement because, of course, historically they have rights to occupancy in these areas, and they have different laws of land ownership. So the first thing that one has to establish is that relationship with that community. Before we did any of the work, which was to assess the mine legacy site issues, the geo, the bio, the water, and even to do any work with the social side, we had to get this agreement with the indigenous peoples. But we were very keen to co-produce a future strategy of realistic interventions, recognising this has been left since 1982, and we have to work with what's been left. And so what we were looking there particularly was to look at a programme of mitigation, potentially metal recovery of where we felt that was appropriate from the waste waters, revegetation, nature and carbon positive sustainable landscape use after that. So the year one target for the project, we were funded to deliver this quantitative baseline data. That year has finished. We've done that. And we've just secured year two funding, which is to implement a series of macrocosm interventions and assess the applicability for those for a long-term plan for the site. But in order for us to get the year one work done, we had to go through and put, as I said, the social aspect front and center. And so the rationale for inclusion was local communities are often excluded from the rehabilitation of legacy mines. And this is the case all through this region, the Philippines. And of course, it leads to suspicion. We just heard actually that well espoused, not engaged, so therefore they're suspicious. So they should be an integral part of the process to ensure success and sustainability. It's legally required, but it's also, they have to be a part of this. Because actually what we found through the course of this, that the views, beliefs, perceptions, aspirations, knowledge, skills and experience are actually critical inputs to this whole process. And a lot of the things that we're going to try coming year are based on their observation. And obviously their trust is essential for true final closure process. So that's why it was front and center. So we started off initially with local political agreement. So the top left there, you can see the use of recycled Starbucks bags here, biodegradable and freely available. So of course they were quite useful. But local political agreement first with the mayors of the barangay, the district, the Tublai district in Benguet province. We then had to move from that political agreement then to the community leadership. So these are the indigenous leaders. On that route, we had to comply legally, obviously, and make sure that the police were sort of smiling when we were on site with them because we were doing the right thing. Obviously, engaging with local custom was important. Having a respect for culture, which included, some of the ceremonies that were related to strangers coming and working on sites. We had to be assessed for actually really for our ethical the reason as to why we were going there and whether we could be trusted to deliver. Actually, one of the interesting things was embracing difference. So the photograph you have there is a local guy who's significantly shorter than one of our Scottish geologists who came on site, and obviously very culturally different, but it was a wonderful example here of the differences of our team. And obviously that with that, we were built a local team. So there was a lot before we even went and picked up a rock, took a water sample, anything. We did all that because actually, I'm sorry, I can't see the top things there. Key social needs for activities there were something called a certificate of precondition, and that's to work with indigenous peoples, and that's a governmental requirement. And then actually to get something called a gratuitous permit. I love that, the word, the gratuitous permit, which allows you to work and collect flora and fauna. So this is obviously respecting biology as well as cultural aspects. And so actually our license to operate was dependent on getting this NCIP clearance and permit, which meant submission of a work plan, hosting of the activities in the barangays through the political process, full disclosure meeting with the community, working with them on a validation and decision making. And then there's a memorandum of activity that we had to sign with them. And that was a certificate of precondition from the NCIP that we'd done all of that to be able to work on these lands, which are effectively controlled by these indigenous people groups. And then on the right-hand side there, we went through a similar process to get the sort of ecological clearance to work, to do the sampling and so on. So again, there was a political process, applications there to the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, then a clearance that allowed you to collect that material, that it was being assessed that it wasn't actually going to cause issues with the biodiversity aspects of the ground. So we then had the gratuitous permit. Again, that led to more another MOA signing with the DENR. And then that all had to come together with ethical clearance, which you needed that certificate of precondition, clearance from the ethics offices at the Philippines universities in order to get the project go ahead to get on the ground. Now, it sounds incredibly laborious, but what that built was trust at all levels with the local peoples, with the politicians, and everybody knew what was going to happen, so that there was kind of no strangers arriving on the site, that because people had been engaged, there'd been public meetings, there'd been stuff in the local press and so on. There was this, even if there wasn't the trust at this stage, there was at least the recognition that they knew what was going to be happening. And so part of that early process was trying to understand local priorities. And it was really interesting when we did a Wordle of what people were felt was really important for them. And actually, minerals weren't very high in there. There wasn't the sort of perception of a polluting legacy. They were more worried about their livestock, their water, their crops, Actually, they were really interested in organic things. They were very, very closely embedded with nature. So they had this understanding of the plants that they were using, which was really interesting and really was very helpful for us when we were looking to kind of build some kind of reconstruction. Jobs was important, but you can see their education and training and so on was equally important. And it was great to see the Jeep word there, because if everyone's gone to the Philippines, it's just covered these wonderful jeepneys, which is the major form of transportation. And they wanted to make sure they had a road that they could have transportation in and out for people to get in and out. So that was great. And so we then were able to assemble our team to get onto the site, and our project, top right there, had modules that were based around the social subsystem. So this was a program of working closely with the community and really harvesting their ideas about what they thought were the issues that they had. Where do they think, what have they done to mitigate it in their own way, naturally, and so on. So we were learning from sort of local work there. Our technical subsystem was the geological bit. So we went there, we did rock samples, we used drones to do remote sensing, digital terrain models, multispectral cameras and LiDAR cameras and so on. And then on the ecological subsystem, we had a monitoring program of the microbiome. So really important to take water for chemistry, but also for microbiology to do eDNA sequencing, the same for the soil, the waste dumps, as well as looking then at the higher plants, the basis of those ecosystems and working with those, and indeed some of the invertebrates that were in the soil and the waste material. So the social aspect was really carrying along at the same time. So it was really good. We had the social team on the site the same time as we had the technical teams. So, and because we'd actually embedded within our team people who spoke the local Austronesian languages. So they were able to communicate directly. And of course, then when we had the technical team, because they were on site, they were able to answer any questions of the social team as we were working. And we collectively met for lunch in the local sort of hall where people could just come and drop in if they had issues, and they would come and talk to us. And they generally got a view, and they helped us a lot, actually, with the physical access and all of those kind of things, because they were really embedded in the program from the beginning. And that was really good. We were able to talk to the farmers directly when we were soil sampling. We were able to sort of show them what, when we found material that related to the old mining activities, and we were able to find out how they'd mitigated sites as they went through, as they came onto the site in the 1980s. And so there was a major field program, and we took a lot of people on the site at one go, but it was good because it felt to be excellent to have, rather than have almost like people coming and going, have everybody there together, and we could bring the community together and talk to them. And the bottom left here, this was our lunch activities, and when the people knew that we would be there, they could come and ask us what people were doing. And one thing we found, actually, bringing in drones was absolutely fabulous way to engage with all the youngsters. And so the local school kids were just, they really amazing how they became drone pilots by the end of the program. And it was a really good way of, because we were able to show them the maps, we could map where their farms were and so on. And it's the first time that people had seen where their map was spatially with respect to, and we could show them their crops, because you could pick the crops out with the resolution of these cameras, and you could tell one farmer that your crops are doing better than the other guy on the other side of the valley. And so all of this was really very interesting data for them. And then we ended up with the first year program of having a social validation meeting. So what we undertook was that we would not share any of the data in the public realm until we'd shared it with the public, with the communities. So we had this validation meeting that was held in November, and you can see we had local population came, they were able to ask questions, because what we did was we assembled a bunch of information that was published in plain language, in their own language, in the local language. We put that ahead of time, had it translated not only into Filipino but into their local Ilano language that is the lingua franca in that area, the Austronesian language. So we did one for the geological data, the remote sensing data, the water chemistry data, the ecological data. That was pretty important because we'd identified there a range of plants, particularly some that were hyperaccumulators that could be perhaps utilized in the future for mediation projects. But then we also were working with the farmers as to what crops they were planting, because we wanted to make sure these things were not uptaking metals that could be problematic. And then we were looking at the soil texture, looking at invertebrates, in this case like earthworms, but we're doing metagenomics, so we get an understanding of the full functionality of the soil and how well that was behaving, and whether there were problematic things in the soil there. And then the social program also derived that. So what came out of that meeting? Well, we really believe that we got trust from local stakeholders, because what we wanted was their buy-in for the year 2 program. And actually, I just put a copy of the letter we received actually at that meeting. And it was actually written to DEFRA from the barangay captain, so the local politician, and the head of the Indigenous Peoples Mandatory Representative. And they were actually requesting that DEFRA give us year 2 funding. So if you like, this was an amazing piece of paper to put into our project case for funding for the second year, because what was very poignant in here is the fact that they acknowledged that we had, this was the first research project that had fully engaged the community from children up to professionals. And I think this was very touching, actually, and we felt pretty humbled that we had achieved that. So we had an enormously careful steps at the beginning to work with that local people, but to the point now where, in a way, if we don't keep our funding going, we're going to try and make sure we don't disappoint. So what we've done for year 2 already started. We've got some bio interventions that we've already were plotting to put in there to clean up the mine wastewater. That's something we tested in the lab back at the museum, and we're going to be able to hopefully introduce that as a way of removing some of those the metals that could be problematic. Luckily at this site, then, the major problem is copper, which we can recover actually, and that can be recovered, captured, and we can bring that down as a sulfide, and it can be sold, because there's plenty of mining operations in northern Luzon that's actually marketable. And then working then on macrocosm experiments with farmers to seek the appropriate soil treatment and planting, and that links into looking at the microbiome. So because we've done a lot of work on both contaminated sites and sites that are non-impacted in that region, we can give them some advice on perhaps some bioinoculants that might help that soil recovering, but also some simple things like maybe some pH mitigation and ways of locking up that. Because actually the tailings pond in this case is a fantastic asset, because it's the only flat area in a very mountainous region, and it makes wonderful raised beds. So what we are doing is working with them to make sure that they aren't growing things where their roots will permeate down into the problematic parts of that tailings. So that's part of the year 2 program, is to make sure that we can they can allow them to do this agriculture, but in ways that will be not detrimental to health because of the metal toxicity. And so that's where I'd like to leave it. Thank you, and really happy to take any questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Richard. So everyone, if you want to put your hands together for the fantastic Richard Harrington, absolutely brilliant. Richard, I've got a bucket load of questions for you, but I'm keeping half an eye on time.
Yeah.
So if you're okay, we'll keep going straight across to Leanne, especially seeing as she stayed up for us in Australia. But if people do have questions for Richard, please do feel free to pop them into the Q&A or into the chat, because I think this is just a fabulous case study for everybody to learn from. Richard, it's brilliant. So moving on to the fabulous Leanne. Leanne, if you have got slides that you need to share, if you want to click those buttons, and we'll make it happen. I am so pleased to welcome to our virtual stage the fantastic founder of Everledger, Leanne Kemp, who's going to tell us, as you can see on the screen, there we go, you've made it very easy for me, Leanne, trusted supply chain, provenance and traceability. Over to you.
Thanks, everyone. I guess my presentation today is a little bit more practical in so much what it takes to build a trusted protocol across supply chains. I began Everledger in 2015 and was completely intrigued by incredibly conflicted and seriously opaque markets. And so we began tracking diamonds from the source of the mine right the way through to the retail network. Close to 9 years later, you could walk now into a Tiffany store and ask where a diamond comes from, and we're able to source and prove that trusted supply chain through a various sets of mechanisms. We're a blockchain company, but blockchain alone will not provide for provenance. It has to come together in a symphony of technologies to enable that trust layer to be built. And distributed technologies like blockchain, I think, play an important role, because obviously honey pots of data in centralized control is certainly a thing of the past. And as we start to embark upon even more greater transparency in supply chains, I'm curious about the data protocols that will be built and what types of data points industry are beckoning to bring together that sort of trusted provenance and traceability. So today I'm not talking about diamonds, I'm actually talking about critical minerals, because it occurred to me within the first year of Everledger what potentially could be the largest, most conflicted supply chain by 2030. And it plagued my mind. If we knew and understood the travesties that unfolded around blood diamonds, what potentially could be the next blood disaster that we could avoid. And the coining of the phrase was blood batteries, lithium-ion batteries, the critical minerals supply chain. And that's definitely become a heightened topic, not only from political leaders, but onshoring with bringing manufacturing back. And then you're starting to see this geopolitical separation and tension across the world as we start to grapple with a really important resource and how we can transition into renewable energy. So suffice to say, since 2016, a year after Everledger began, when I was the global chair for the World Economic Forum in advanced manufacturing, the Global Battery Alliance and the thought around that was given birth in the Geneva head office. And since that time, we see now, many governments taking a hold of what we call the battery directive, particularly in Europe. And that's sparking a significant amount of flagging interest in mining companies right the way through to the end supply itself in batteries. And this trusted supply chain isn't necessarily just driven on which country does it come from. It also looks at where does it go to after it leaves me. So provenance is also a forward-looking lens. We think about end of life. What does that do when we talk about a battery? How do you disassemble and reassemble this battery and repurpose and recycle these materials? And so when I think about the work now over the better part of the last sort of 6 years, it's very clear that battery regulation is groundbreaking reform, particularly in the EU, and it covers the entire life cycle and mandate of the product being an ore body in the ground, right the way through to the physical asset itself. And the regulation categories that have really become amplified, particularly over the last number of years through Europe. And what I'm showing you today is the output of the work with the German government under the Federal Ministry of Economic Affairs. And it really amplifies the life cycle stages across the supply chain and the types of categorizations that governments are interested in. Interestingly, in the diamond industry, it was a lot of pressure on industry was placed because of the questions coming from consumers, and regulation followed. This is quite the opposite. Regulation is leading in so much that they are looking at these categorizations and the requirements. You'll see across life cycle stages that in material sourcing and production, that sort of early stage processing really arches across each of these regulation categories, from the restriction of substances right the way through to the carbon footprint, and then even the waste battery management in terms of its end of life. And so it does beg the question, where do we go to from here? And I'm curious not only about the physical supply chain element, but also this mirroring of the digital supply chain element. And so as we start to see a lot of this work is being led in 3 major jurisdictions, clearly it's Europe around the digital product passports. And that's not just limited to the supply chain of critical minerals or batteries. We're seeing this in textiles, in diamonds, we're seeing it in agriculture. So digital product passports are here to stay. It's a concept that involves the creation of a digital record of a product environment and social impact throughout its entire lifespan. And arguably, it's been driven as a key tool for advancing this European twin transition that many industry bodies and leaders are now embracing. Massive initiatives across in China, as well as in the Inflation Reduction Act, particularly in the US, specifically as it relates to the tax credit for electric vehicle batteries, which is driving a significance of this work. But did we really untrust this industry in the first instance, or were we just purely opaque and unorganized? That's sort of still the question that's plaguing many people's minds. But the timeline for the European battery regulation was really driven from the adoption of the Commission proposal back in December 2020, right in the heart of the COVID crisis, right the way through now, where we start to see the evolution of this legislation already being contemplated in its secondary legislation process right the way out to 2032, with mandated vision for the battery passport adoption by 2027. And we're sitting right now at the precipice of, sort of protocols and understanding of supply chain across each of those data points. There's a content guide that was really provided out of this work with the German government under BATPass, which was also a collective structure of the Global Battery Alliance as well. There is a long list of data attributes, so as well as the carbon footprint ruling and the end of life analysis. And when I see this sort of content guidance, it begs a question in my mind that arguably this sort of trust protocol, particularly in a digital form, has simply been missing. So we've had the wiring that's enabled us in a building, but at the moment we're now trying to put these light switches on so we can illuminate a supply chain. The question is, many people are thinking that it's a light switch, it simply turn it on or off. But if you're as close to the action as we are, we know that it's a dimmer switch. It's going to take some time to refine the right level of illumination across the supply chain. This image in front of you depicts a really great positioning across the supply chain. And as you can see, it's circular in so much that it looks at the mining, the refining, right the way through to the end user itself. And because we have extended producer responsibilities now, again, it's not good enough for a manufacturer to purely pass on the responsibility of its product in a post-life experience. There is policy that's being enacted now that enables that end of life to become the responsibility of the automotive OEM, not just the battery producer themselves. So an entirely new burgeoning industry is coming to the forefront. Multi-trillion-dollar industry is being born purely out of the collector, the recycler, the refurbisher market itself. And it begs a question in my mind, what type of new business models will evolve from the enablement of traceability, particularly with critical minerals, and whether that mineral itself, who will own it, who will have the right to process it, and who will have the right to on-sell it. There are 7 content clusters now that arguably make up the digital product passport, but these are the trust protocols or the trust layer of data that needs to be intertwined. There's the general battery information itself around the manufacturer. There's the compliance, label, and certifications. Some of this compliance, labeling, and certifications has long stood as an external validated third-party attribute. But if we start to think about a total connected supply chain in the way that we're building it today, the role of auditors and the role of those intermediaries fundamentally change with the evolution of technologies like blockchain. The battery carbon footprint, circularity, battery materials, supply chain due diligence in its own form, and then the performance and durability. When we think about this, I think that we have had long-term trust structures in place, typically driven by financial institutions like KYC, Know Your Customer. But as the evolution of this has risen over the course of the last 8 years, we're really building an entirely new approach to KYO. It's a knockout punch if you think about it. It's know your object. That object level data, as well as know your supplier, is going to become the most powerful connection across the supply chain. This is a visualization of what a battery passport looks like. Some of this data had already existed in industry, and a significant amount of it was actually not existing. And so therein lies the challenge for the supply chain and many participants. When I think about a diamond supply chain, it's clearly about 16 hops. A diamond is cut, is mined, it's a rock, it's validated, it's cross-bordered, it then runs to a certification, it's cut and polished, and then ultimately it is placed in a ring on a consumer's finger. But a supply chain like critical minerals, where there is precursor material, it's a far more complicated supply chain than simply digging a hole, extracting a rock and cutting it for a diamond. And therein lies the complexity. It's really made up of 4 main tabs. And this information and this prototype or pilot was released as a part of the World Economic Forum work in Davos in January this year. So this is only really 3 months in its ingestion stage. A second tab is around material. What is fascinating about this work is not only just the declaration that exists across the supply chain and where the materials have come from, but it also looks at the total reverse bill of materials of an object, the percentage of materials that have been physically traced, and the amount of coverage of those materials across the object that's being made. And the object in this instance is a battery itself. It begs in my mind the question, where does trust start and end? And is 4% or 2% in traceability elements enough? And without that underlying data, does that help to provide a degradation of trust? Because is 4% too small to trust some type of data that's validated, let alone no data? And I guess this question over time will start to erode the minds of consumers. The third tab is around ESG and the metrics. And it really digs into a series of questions, particularly around child labour and human rights. And it deeply looks at the algorithms around the calculation of greenhouse gas emissions. And a lot of this work has been dug deeply into the primary critical minerals themselves: lithium, cobalt, nickel, manganese, and even vanadium in the new forms of battery free flow. And the third tab, which is what I'm most excited about, is really the data layer, this sort of digital value chain and the data value chain that needs to be built to enable trust of an object or enable trust of a supply chain. Broken down for a battery supply chain is mining, refining, precursing. You can see it on the screen. And yet it's also broken up into the identity of those companies involved in the supply chain, as well as the physical material flows and any of the ESG and sustainability related data. But as you can see in this sort of data value chain, there isn't certainly enough validated, interoperable protocols that exist today that do enable us to be able to tick all of the boxes. And I know we have to start somewhere, but maybe starting with the end in sight enables us to build the right level of the data value chain, as well as the digital provenance, which will drive a lot of the consumer trust in the end. Supply chains and physical supply chains exist. However, digital supply chains are in its very early stages, and there isn't international protocols that enables us to mirror this digital provenance in a solid way. We are purely refitting digital provenance into a physical world, rather than designing for that digital provenance in the first output. The implementation of these rules is going to be regulated over a course of around 22 months and come into force with the battery regulation itself. And what is causing the greatest magnetic effect is clearly the decarbonisation of supply chains. And it's the key policy measure that is really driving this work towards the battery passport itself. So the carbon footprint and the repeated nature of that is something that is the large North Star that we're chasing. But again, we're still missing the other elements of concern around environment, particularly methane as a prime example. A battery regulation defines a specific carbon footprint reporting measurement, and it also reflects in the timelines that we see. Declarations in the first instance will not hold the threshold over time. And as we have been involved so deeply in a number of supply chains, Scope 3 feels like a very long tail fairy tale that isn't necessarily going to be easily attributed to the whole of life of a supply chain. And so therefore, a lot of the data that is being captured is in a high-level survey form, and or it's in different forms of data being structured and unstructured. And as we start to see the evolution of other technologies, combining that symphony effect that I was speaking about before, artificial intelligence, increased sensor technologies, plus blockchain, the symphony of these technologies will help to provide this additive approach to data collection and this additive approach to data measurements, which simply isn't mature today, but I'm hopeful it will be in the next number of years. So the recommendation across the line in any supply chain is to necessarily start with that digital twin in mind and enable that carbon footprint to ensure that there's company-specific data that is being collected. As we began this work in the diamond industry, it was very clear after 8 million gemstones on our platform, people asked the question to me, what enabled that network effect? And the answer was very clear. It was the alignment. It was the alignment of industry where each of the participants could enable themselves to, oh my God, I just got fatigue at 3 o'clock in the morning. I'll skip that. I'll have to keep going. I'm so sorry. I'm exhausted. The lack of transparency and regulation to create supply chains is really driving, and the due diligence in the regulatory context is still in its early formation. But we're hopeful that this will be addressed in time. This supply chain itself, one of the biggest issues that we see is certainly in the assessment and the recommendation around consumer pre-waste, and then, of course, consumer post-waste, specifically for cobalt, nickel, lithium, and lead. Lead batteries, of course, has been a long-standing position in the industry, and arguably lead acid batteries have been recycled for the better part of millennia. But when we think about the data attributes as it leads in for an end of life for lithium-ion batteries, we're certainly nowhere near the level of technology required to be able to have a post-consumer recycle event that will take up all of the elements of the supply chain. I just thought I'd quickly play what an actual application looks like. I've got about 6 minutes here. And if we've got time, I'll just give it a shot.
When you and the team are pitching,
oh, sorry.
Grammarly's tone suggestions can offer a more personal. Your battery password has been developed with the critical guidance and input of key industry organizations.
I think, Leanne, the sound's not quite working at the moment. But what we might do is if we can post that link into the chat, then everyone can take a proper look at it, if that's okay.
Yeah, I will do that. No problems.
Fabulous. That would be fantastic. Thanks, Leanne. I know that we've got John Crawley with us here for his talk that was due to be happening right at this second. But I just wondered, Leanne, we've got one very quick question from Johannes, and he asks, how certain do we feel that any price premium will be available for those who comply with these new transparency requirements? What do you reckon?
We're not.
Great answer.
Yeah, we're not confident. What I'm more interested in is the end of life and who it's the race. The race is on for who is going to grab and who has the right to these critical minerals, particularly at its end of life cycling. And if you think about some governments are jostling even different lease right models for the extractives part of the industry, I think there's a burgeoning space of this end of life processing with recyclers and refurbishers. But it's very clear that the mid-tier of the market, whether it be the battery manufacturer themselves or the OEM, they too are making very clear stipulations of that end of life, that just because you've unscrewed the screw to disassemble the battery doesn't mean that that black mass is yours to have. And so I think that's the interesting disruptor in the industry, is where will that go? How will that play out? And therein lies the race is on. I don't think it's I think it's about who gets to grab the volume.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Leanne. And again, a fantastic talk, really giving us insight into what is going on in that world at the moment. So thank you very much. Round of applause for Leanne, everybody. Truly brilliant.
I'm going to sleep.
Good
Good
plan.
night, everyone.
Good plan. Thanks, Leanne. Fantastic. Excellent. So our final speaker for this afternoon is the fantastic John Crawley, who, as we have previously mentioned in today's session, is going to give us the Irish perspective with regards to trust. Now, John, if you've got some slides, do you want to hit share now? I know that you are a true expert when it comes to all things Zoom, so I will let you click the buttons. and then pass across to your wonderful self. Yeah, excellent. It's almost doing it. It'll get there soon enough. There we go. Perfect. Everybody, I give you John Crawley. Fantastic.
Hello, folks, and you're very welcome. Thank you very much for inviting me into your space. I've been listening in on and off over the last hour, and I think I follow some of the words. Certainly, I get some of them. I heard of the word battery, and I heard of the word some of these things before, so I'm getting it. I'm an accountant, okay? I'm a risk professional. I'm a master trainer of some sort, and I like to have a bit of fun doing presentations. So we started, as I always do, any presentation I do with a little bit of music. So you were listening to a Northern Ireland gentleman called Phil Coulter, okay, who wrote a song called Ireland's Call. And I'm using that as my backdrop to actually introduce my session today, because my session is Build Trust, an Irish Political Perspective. So the one thing I will not be talking about is anything geological, but geographical I will do. Okay, so there's a bit of geo in me, okay, which I will get to. Phil Coulter wrote a song a number of years ago. I live on an island with two countries, Northern Ireland, which is part of the UK, and the Republic of Ireland. And we have an All-Ireland rugby team. We're not bad, actually. We've beaten the All Blacks a couple of times. Okay, so kudos to the boys. But the dilemma arose as to what national anthem would we play at games? Would we play as you know, God Save the King / Queen? Would we play the Irish national anthem? What would we do? So, in the spirit, I suppose, of community, in the spirit of hands across the border, probably in the spirit of trust, and this is built upon sort of years that started, which we look at on an earlier slide, built on a common shared platform of trust. We actually created an anthem, Ireland's Call, okay, which you'll hear rallied out at rugby matches. So the next time you're in Twickenham, okay, or the next time you're in Stade de France, or the next time you're somewhere where the Irish are tranching the British, the England or Wales or Scotland, or being tranched by, listen out for that song, Ireland's Call, Phil Coulter. Okay, what's that got to do with what I'm going to talk about? Okay, it's just a small little background to it. Let me set my little foray into the world of trust into some sort of context for you. So, somewhere in the dim and distant past, over a cup of coffee or possibly a glass of wine, Sarah and I have had many rambling conversations about different things. And in one of those conversations, I regaled stories that I would have had myself from a very limited, but at the same time participative role in what we now know as the Good Friday Agreement, or the Northern Ireland or Belfast Agreement. And Sarah prompted me to talk about this today in the context of, did trust play a role in that? Okay, or did politics play a role? Did commerce play a role? And I started scratching my head and thinking about it, and kicked it around, okay, with a couple of my colleagues for a while, and thought, actually, do you know what? It is actually the bedrock of it. So let me set it into some sort of context for you. So Northern Ireland, so I'm limiting myself to what we call in Ireland the Troubles. Okay, so if you hear Irish people talking about this, and if you hear about it and you'll see a clip from, or you'll see a screenshot from Derry Girls coming up in a short while, they will talk about the Troubles, okay? And what are the Troubles? Well, the Troubles basically started in Northern Ireland in 1979. The stark numbers in brackets, just as I talked through the timeline, is the death rate associated with violence in Northern Ireland over a period of time. So 1968, it kicked off with civil rights marches, and 16 people lost their lives in that period of time. People started to scramble around to say, how do we solve this problem? And to be fair, politicians got involved at an early stage, and the British government of the day in the mid-1970s brought a number of people together in Sunningdale and created what became known as the Sunningdale Agreement, okay, where the death toll at this stage had risen up to 942 people. And it was about trying to sort of see, can we get some sort of solution to the sectarianism and the issues associated with that? It fell over. Okay, it fell over after a couple of months. 1981, time moving along, debt toll up to 2,291. Margaret Thatcher, Prime Minister at the time, IRA Republican prisoner, Bobby Sands, incarcerated in jail for presumably terrorism activities, and probably rightly so as a result of that, ran for election and stood as an MP, in Northern Ireland, and was elected to Commons. Died on hunger strike in jail. And it became a little bit of a turning point, because all of a sudden the world was starting to say, what is going on in Ireland? And are these guys ever going to do anything about this? Out of the shadows came John Hume, the then leader of the SDLB party in Northern Ireland, sadly passed away a couple of years ago. Death toll now 2,874, 1988. Started to talk to the IRA. That wasn't a particularly popular thing to do at the time. These were extreme terrorists, and they were up there with, the modern day equivalent of the Al-Qaedas. And yet talk to them he did. He very quickly enlisted the help of the then president in the US, Bill Clinton, who has become instrumental, in not only building the peace, but in maintaining it over a period of time. Bill came on board, in Northern Ireland in 1995. Death toll now 3,376 dead human beings as a result of mindless violence due to terrorism. Over the short number of years that followed, we eventually hacked out what has become known lovingly as the Belfast Agreement, or the Good Friday Agreement. And the clock, pretty much from a death toll point of view, peaked and effectively stopped at that stage at just slightly short of 3,500. We celebrate 25 years on this last month and this year. And yes, deaths have continued in Northern Ireland through violence, as they have proportionately in Liverpool, or in Dundee, or in Melbourne, And I don't mean to call it normal violence, but it is slightly more normalized, So that was the backdrop. So what were the components, And I love playing with words, And when I started to play with the trust word, the following words came into my head: terrorism, obviously the problem, the root cause. Entrenched with republicanism, very much on the nationalist side, but unionism, and terrorism on that side, and ultimately, I suppose, just general sectarianism. And yet, there was always a hankering, in all of this to see, is there some class of treaty? Is there some class of settlement? Is there something that can be done about all of this? And actually, the quiet spoken voice that probably brought a lot of this to its senses were the good ladies of Northern Ireland on all sides, who actually said, and they formed effectively a women's coalition, enough is enough. Guys, put the guns away, let's start talking. And it became, I suppose, the germ of the idea of a treaty of some sort. So enter the players onto the stage, and some of these players would have actually had frames around their faces in previous times, not good frames. They could have been standing in police stations, as most wanted, etc. So from the likes of Martin McGuinness, now passed away, to Gerry Adams, both leaders of effectively Sinn Féin IRA, on the left-hand side of the slide, to David Irvine, a leader of a unionist paramilitary organization, to David Trimble, a leader, of a legitimate unionist organization, and then to John Hume, the guy I talked about earlier on in the centre, who effectively acted as the broker. The other important players that really underpinned the trust in all of this, the very outspoken but loving and caring Mo Molan, the then Secretary for State for Northern Ireland, who didn't call, a thing that sat on the side of a farmyard an agricultural instrument. She called a spade a spade. She was well able to call it out for what it was, and harangued and dragged the various different players together to say, we need to talk. There's brilliant imagery of her going around in Northern Ireland at the moment, of 1998 and getting the parties around the table, and her running from one room to the other, as she had her chemo drip following her around, okay, and had dispensed, with the wig that she was wearing, okay, and in her trackies, just saying, for God's sake, lads, are we going to do this thing, or are we not? To the leaders and the brokers and effectively the guarantors, okay, the Prime Minister in the UK and the Prime Minister in Northern Ireland, underpinned by George Mitchell, the special envoy from Bill Clinton. And I guess those guys all together, politicians, democratically elected people, terrorists, all around a table or series of tables saying, there's got to be a better way. There's got to be something we got to do here. And what was common, okay, to every participant's role, okay, in this, they started to trust each other. They had no rational basis for doing it, and yet they did. Okay, they built upon that. Yes, we had upsets, of course. 1998, okay, was part of a journey, and if you ever get the pleasure of traveling around Derry or Belfast in particular, you'll be impressed by the murals that you'll see on walls, and go on some of the tours. And this image of prepared for peace, ready for war, epitomized the fragility of that trust, and yet it endured. Okay. Now, once we got the deal done, we had to sell the idea. So people like Bono from U2 came center stage and says, look, we, will start, okay, popularizing, okay, this deal that's been put together, because we need to build upon this trust. We want this thing to work. Okay, we need to, trust needs to be underpinned with public opinion. It needs to be underpinned with public support, and you need to bring people in. It needs to be recognized. Internationally, it became recognized. John Hume and David Trimble receiving the Nobel Peace Prize, okay, for it. And that gave it very strong stature. That gave it very strong recognition. We created a new world order. Absolute arch enemies, Ian Paisley, okay, and Martin McGuinness, effectively became known lovingly as the Chuckle Brothers. Okay, where they shared power together as the first and the deputy first minister of Northern Ireland. They started to build upon that trust and say, actually, we've got to lock arms and lock hands to do it. And Arlene Foster and Michelle O'Neill in more recent years, and I know the Assembly has broken down, but it's broken down the same way that parliaments break down all over the world. But yet the trust remains that we're trying to find a way to do this. Now, there was also a realization, and this is where I played a tiny role. Okay, there was also a realization that, if we hang up or we decommission our arms and our balaclavas, okay, and our grenades, we still have the same people in Northern Ireland, but we've got to do things in new ways. And fundamentally, if you think about it from a commerce point of view, the terrorist organizations winding themselves up effectively had to execute, excuse the pun, okay, they effectively had to deliver a huge redundancy campaign. They had to make loads of terrorists unemployed because there was no longer money to be made out of that, okay, because that was the day job that was discontinued. And we had to figure out a way to rehabilitate those. And I was working in a bank in Northern Ireland at the time. And one of our roles was to say, hang on, we need to trust these people, to lend them money, to set up new businesses for themselves, etc. So, we had to find alternative things for people to do, okay, that previously were involved in this world. So it was just another step. It was just another lever. It was just another thing we had to do to make sure that the trust operated. And of course, we continue to celebrate it, and it's really important that we've seen this in South Africa, and we've seen it in other parts of the world where we have truth commissions and we have reflective things that go on. And I mean, if you're looking for a good reflective piece on this, look at the last episode that was filmed of Derry Girls, because it's all fundamentally about the building of that trust that underpinned the Belfast Agreement, the Good Friday Agreement, but done in a very sensitive way through the lens of teenagers, okay, and the different roles that they had to play in all of that. To me, a very good test of that trust, okay, how does trust endure? So Brexit was and is a challenge, okay, and the Irish border issue and the Irish Sea issue has become very much centre stage of exit agreements and everything associated with that. And I'm not going to wander into Brexit, okay, because I'm almost about to wrap up, Sarah, okay, but everybody put their shoulder to the wheel to say, There is a Good Friday Agreement. There is a trust agreement that's there. We must respect it. Okay. But yet, you know, and they did. And they had to figure out some harrowing days of, will we go back to some of the old days if this Brexit thing doesn't work right? And to be fair to all of the parties, there was never even, practically speaking, on the ground, a hint of the breakdown of that fundamental trust that was signed up to on Good Friday of 1998. So, of course, we continue to celebrate it, you know, and everybody endures that. And of course, we need to continue with it. And the Bill Clintons of this world are very good at that. And Hillary Clinton is still to this day, okay, you know, the Chancellor of Queen's University in Belfast. That's the level of connection she has with it. But also, you know, the good people of Northern Ireland, basking in the sunshine, okay, of what has been achieved, still continue to reflect on what was, in their view, for their small little part of the world, a seismic change built on trust. Trust to a level, okay, where terrorists that previously killed Lord Mountbatten, okay, were still, okay, able to shake the hands of the Queen, or the Queen to shake their hands, or to turn up at the coronation, okay, of King Charles III this week, coming from Republican or Unionist terrorism backgrounds. There was an acceptance back into the community that there was something that was built on trust that does endure. So to wrap up, why does trust work? Or why the trust worked in this scenario? There was a willingness of the parties. There was political endorsement or government endorsement. There was strong public commitment, and that was hard won, and the Bonos of this world had to work hard on that. There was a realism that hurdles remained. And most importantly, we celebrated every little success. So there was truth, there was respect. We acted in unison. The self was also preserved and recognized, because not everybody agreed, and not everybody was brought on the journey, but the majority were. But what did we end up with? Trust. Thank you.
John Crawley, you genius. That was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much. Absolutely brilliant. And you can see everybody is still applauding from their screens behind us. So what I'm going to do, John, actually, is just encourage our other speakers who are still with us from earlier on during the session to turn on their cameras if you guys are there, and just open this up and actually say, is there anything in what John's just described to us? Of course, and as John has said, he didn't go anywhere near the mining bit, but that's totally fine, John, because actually learning from this massive part of history, what can we learn with regards to trust is huge. I don't know, Richard, if you've got anything that you'd like to reflect on, either with regards to what John's just said or what you've heard through this afternoon, and then maybe if I go to Johannes.
Well, I mean, that was really great, John, and you know, having been through all of that, you know, my life really, having seen the troubles from 1969 when I was the age of 10, how it all has gone on and kind of healed itself. I think what's really interesting, I think it shows that you can't go to depths too deep to pull back from. So, you know, it's quite clear that how you can't go any deeper than really wanting to kill the people that you live next door to. But, you know, people have come back from that. So what I would say is you can rebuild trust even when it's completely broken. And it's the thing I learned from it is getting the people actually involved. The politicians are important because but actually it's got to come from the groundswell. And I think, as you said, it's perhaps the women in Northern Ireland who were sick and tired of their husbands, brothers, sons, and whatever being shooting one another, and that was also important. So it's kind of empowering a part of the community that perhaps didn't have a voice to help turn that. And I think that's what we're going to see perhaps in the problems that's happening in Ukraine and Russia. It's when there's a part of the community that doesn't have a voice currently who suddenly finds a voice that are then able to kind of do that. But that's, I think, big learning for me is when I saw what happened in Northern Ireland, you realise you can turn back from something, even however dark it is, you can bring it, you can get trust out of suspicion. And I think that's the biggest lesson for me.
Thanks, Richard.
Thank you. Thanks, Richard. Johannes, how about yourself? And then if John wants to comment on any of it, feel free to chip in, John.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks, Richard, for that takeaway. I think that's a valuable takeaway indeed, that it doesn't matter how bad things get. Here's an example of where you can pull things back and start again. And perhaps like the earlier speaker said, if you didn't plant the tree 20 years ago, at least plant the tree today. The takeaway that I took, I had never thought, I was aware in the Brexit negotiations that all of Europe stood behind the Good Friday Agreement. I had never seen it from the perspective that you gave, which to me was saying, have a look at how trusted that agreement is. The trust that's been built was even stronger than Brexit.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'd like to offer that as a takeaway message. And with respect to some of the things I was saying earlier today, I think that obviously speaks to the strength of the agreement and how people bought into it, and people were really that prepared to stand by it, and even stakeholders beyond Ireland, i.e. the rest of the European Union. Now, something that I didn't mention in our talk, but something that's very much part of the method that we were describing today, is we try to keep in mind the default option. So whenever you're making a decision, it's a mistake to think that if you don't decide, nothing happens. Yeah? What's the default option? And I think you put in very stark language and statistics what the default option was, and perhaps that was a very strong motivator for people to really make sure they had a solid agreement at the end. So thank you for that.
Brilliant. Thanks, Johannes. John, do you have any reflections on what Richard and Johannes have just said?
Yeah, I think I'm taking a very small view or in a very small segment, but I think there's lessons in all of this, and although I don't understand some of the science of what Sarah talks about from time to time, I do understand the principles, and I do understand the strategy. And I think there's parallels that we can take out of trust learnings from other walks of life, and I guess there's others, okay, that you could equally talk about as well, because if we want to have, here's me borrowing some of Sarah's vocabulary here now, if we want to have just transitions, if we want to have adult ways of moving from one to something else, okay, then that requires people having a leap of faith and having a trust in some sort. And what are the things that we need to do to dig deep to make that trust it's resilient to deal with all the knocks that are inevitably going to come, okay? Because there's inevitably going to be really tough knocks that are coming at it. And how do you build agreements? How do you build frameworks? How do you build just transitions that endure the knocks? You do that because you get people together who fundamentally trash it out, argue their point, but then come to a mutual trust, a mutual respect, and then they stick with it.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much for that, John. Now, Ludovine, I know that we've been messaging behind the scenes. Do you have any words of wisdom to leave us with before I wrap up for the day?
No, I wanted to thank John also for making that distinction of the initial leap of faith, which faith by definition requires no proof, which is not the same thing as the enduring trust you build. And that's a lot of the hard work. And this does connect to a lot of the issues we're talking about, because at the moment, the lack of trust between elements of the value chain, but also between blocks and countries, is a huge part of the difficulty. One thing that I did find striking is I'm a big fan of the first follower theory of management or leadership. And what I find interesting is that you had one person needing to take a leap of faith, but then a second person being Bill Clinton, taking a leap of faith on that person. So that for me, again, comes back to the complexity of value chains, where very often we don't know who's taking a leap of faith where. So all of the transparency conversations that we've had, they're not just about ticking a box or creating control. They're about enabling that situation when you see a leap of faith as an actor in the value chain that you think has value, to allow you to become the first follower.
Yeah.
And in a way, that's leadership across very complex and difficult and opaque situations. So thanks. That was a great lesson.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that, Ludovine. And I think just building on that and what you were saying there about the leaps of faith and allowing people to be the fast or first followers, etc. I guess what's going on perhaps in the world of raw materials at the moment is there's so much change, and there are lots of people saying, well, which leaps of faith should I be making? Which direction should I be jumping at the moment? Because I'm willing to come on this journey. I'm willing to trust you. I just don't know what the right answer is at the moment, because it's a very complex system that we're working in at the moment. So fantastic. Firstly, thank you so much to all of our fabulous speakers from this afternoon. Absolutely brilliant session. Thank you so much. Just wrapped up, I think, John, with your Irish music there. So thank you very much for that. Truly brilliant. So just to very quickly recap, we started off this afternoon session with Robin getting us to think, okay, how do you actually do this thing called reflective listening, i.e. properly listening to somebody and being curious in what they're saying? That then flowed through the rest of this afternoon, where Priscilla gave us insight to some of the great work that's going on in the world of tailings dams and some fantastic opportunities that sit within that space, but also as well building on the need to create trust between those people who are operating and managing those tailings facilities and those who are living round about them, for example. Then across into Johannes and Volker, looking at again, so building basically on the listening side of things and saying, okay, how do we actually build this trust between different parties? That was then built on by Adrian even more. So really looking at, okay, who am I with regards to who am I in myself, through all the way to trust in the market as a whole. Then Richard gave us fabulous insight and I think a fantastic case study in terms of how to really respect a community and actually work with them when you're undertaking a wide variety of different types of research. Also as well, we then heard from Leanne, who'd stayed up so late. She did actually request that speaking slot, just to make that clear to everybody, because some people do work really well in the middle of the night. So Leanne gave us insight to really one of the world's leading tools in terms of blockchain and transparency. And then, of course, finally over to Ireland and to John and the fabulous case study there of the trust that was built and maintained, or resilient trust, with regards to the Good Friday Agreement. So with that, we'll be back again tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. We've got a fabulous day lined up for you. Go and check out the agenda on the website. I am swamped in all the notes that I've been taking, but this is absolutely fantastic. Thank you very, very much, everybody, and see you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Cool. Thanks, everybody. Fantastic.